Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I got on the train just before noon. It wasn't too crowded. I found a seat by the window, put my bag on my lap, and settled in. It was supposed to be a long ride, 3 different trains to get to my sister's place. I had my headphones in, just trying to zone out. I noticed him at the first stop. He got a few cars down, middle-aged, maybe late 40s. Dark jacket, ball cap pulled low. I only noticed him because he stood by the doors instead of sitting down, like he was waiting for something. But a lot of people do that on short rides, so I didn't think much of it. The second train was busier. I switched lines, found another window seat. When I glanced up, I saw him again, standing near the doors. Same jacket, same cap. He didn't look at me, just stood there facing forward. I told myself it was a coincidence. It had to be. People ride the same routes all the time. But then the third train came. It was almost empty when I got on. I sat near the back this time, tired from carrying my bag around. I kept my head down, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I saw him the second he walked through the doors. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside and stood by the doors again, gripping the rail with both hands. That's when I knew. He wasn't riding the train. He was following me. I felt sick. My mind started racing, trying to figure out when he'd first seen me, if it was at the station or maybe even before that. I thought about switching cars, but I didn't want to make it obvious that I noticed him. I kept sneaking glances, but he never looked right at me. He just stood there, still, like he was waiting for something. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. Maybe he was going the same way. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then the train stopped at another station, and a few people got off. He stayed put. When the train started moving again, he shifted his stance a little. That was the first time I caught him looking at me. It was quick, just a glance, but it was enough. His eyes flicked toward me, then back to the doors. Like he was checking to see if I was still there. I felt trapped. The car was too empty. There was no one close enough to notice if something happened. I didn't want to make a scene. I kept trying to think of what I should do, if I should call someone, or get off at the next stop. But then what? What if he followed me off the train? I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't want to find out. I pulled out my phone and pretended to text, but my hands were shaking. I looked up a few times, trying to catch someone's eye, but no one was paying attention. He kept glancing at me now, more often than before. Just little looks out of the corner of his eye. The train slowed down for another stop. I made a decision. I stood up and grabbed my bag like I was about to get off. His head snapped toward me, so quick I almost missed it. He didn't move at first. He just watched. I walked toward the doors, heart pounding in my chest. I felt his eyes on my back the whole way. When the train stopped, I stepped off and stayed close to the platform, pretending to check my phone. The doors stayed open for a few seconds longer than usual. Then he got off. He didn't even hesitate. He stepped out onto the platform and leaned against one of the columns, not looking at me but not looking anywhere else either. Just waiting. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was too scared to move. I stood there frozen, pretending to type on my phone. I kept hoping he would walk away, that I was wrong. He didn't. The next train was already pulling into the station. I forced myself to move, stepping onto the new train like nothing was wrong. I didn't look at him. I didn't have to. I felt him behind me. I sat near the doors, trying to stay close to people this time. He stayed standing, just a few feet away. I watched his reflection in the window. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was watching me now, steady and patient. I couldn't breathe. I kept waiting for him to make a move, but he never did. He just stood there. The whole ride, stop after stop, always close but never too close. I couldn't take it anymore. At the next station, I got up and walked off the train without looking back. I went straight to the ticket office and told the first person I saw that someone was following me. They called security. By the time they showed up, he was gone. They asked me to describe him. I told them everything I could: his jacket, his cap, the way he always stood by the doors. They said they would check the cameras, but I don't know if they ever found him. No one ever called me back. I've thought about him a lot since then. How calm he was. How patient. Like he'd done it before. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gone to the ticket office that day. I don't let myself think about it for too long. We were driving through the middle of nowhere, cutting across states to get to my sister's wedding. It was supposed to be a fun trip. Just the two of us, taking turns driving, stopping wherever we wanted. We left early that morning and planned to keep going until we got tired. It was late afternoon when I noticed the truck. My wife was driving. I saw it in the side mirror first: big, white semi with a silver grille. There were other trucks on the road, but this one stuck close behind us, even when the highway was wide open. I didn't say anything at first. Maybe the guy was just heading the same way. But after 20 miles, he was still there. I kept glancing back, and every time I did, he was in the exact same spot, a little too close, like he was matching our speed on purpose. I told my wife to change lanes. She did, and the truck followed. A few minutes later, she changed back. So did he. I tried to brush it off. Long stretches of highway can mess with your head. Maybe I was making something out of nothing. But then he started getting closer. Not enough to seem obvious, just inching forward, a few feet at a time. Every time I looked back, he was closer than before. I told my wife to speed up. She didn't argue. We pushed past 80, then 90. The truck stayed right behind us, never falling back, never pulling ahead. Just sitting there, looming. After a while, I told her to pull off at the next gas station. I thought maybe if we stopped, he'd keep going and that would be the end of it. We took the exit. I kept watching the mirror the whole time, waiting for him to pass us by. He didn't. The truck followed us off the highway. There was a little gas station just off the ramp. My wife pulled in, and I told her to stay in the car. I went inside, trying not to look like I was watching. The truck parked across the lot, a few spots away. The engine stayed on. The driver didn't get out. I bought 2 bottles of water just to have something to do with my hands. The whole time I stood at the counter, I could feel him watching from behind the windshield. When I walked back to the car, the truck's headlights flicked on for a second. Just a little flash, like he was letting me know he saw me. I got in and told my wife to drive. I didn't explain anything. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. We pulled back onto the highway. A few minutes later, the truck followed. By then, the sun was starting to set. The road stretched out empty in front of us. No exits, no towns, just miles of nothing. He stayed behind us the whole time, never more than 2 car lengths back. I kept trying to figure out what he wanted. Maybe we cut him off earlier without realizing. Maybe it was some kind of road rage thing. But if that was it, why hadn't he tried to pass us or honk or anything? He just followed, waiting. It was full dark when I saw him flash his brights. Once, then twice. We were the only ones on the road by then. He could have passed us any time, but he stayed right behind, flicking his lights every few minutes. I told my wife to take the next exit, even if it was just a dirt road. Anything to get off the highway. The sign said there was a town 5 miles ahead. She gripped the wheel so tight her knuckles were white. When we finally saw the turnoff, I made her take it at the last second. No blinker, no slowing down. Just a hard swerve. The truck's headlights flashed behind us, bright enough to light up the whole car. He followed. The road was narrow and winding, no streetlights, nothing but trees and empty fields. My wife kept glancing in the mirror, breathing fast. I tried to tell her it was okay, that he'd give up soon. I didn't believe it myself. He stayed right behind us, brights flicking on and off. Closer now, only 1 car length back. I could see the silhouette of him in the cab, a thick shape behind the wheel, no face, no features. Just a figure watching. I kept looking for a driveway or a turnoff, anything we could pull into. But there was nothing out there. Just miles of dark road and the truck filling the mirror. Then he hit the horn. Long and low, the sound rattled through the car. My wife flinched, hands tightening on the wheel. He laid on the horn again, even louder this time. The whole road seemed to shake with it. I told her to keep driving. I don't know how long it went on him blaring the horn, us flying down that road with the headlights filling the car. Finally, I saw a little side road, just gravel and a rusted out sign. I told her to take it. She jerked the wheel hard, and we skidded onto the narrow track, bouncing over potholes. The truck's headlights lit up the trees, but he didn't follow. He just sat there at the turnoff, idling. The horn stopped. We drove until we couldn't see the lights anymore, then pulled off into the trees. We killed the engine and sat there in the dark, holding our breath. The night was so quiet it hurt. I don't know how long we stayed there. Could have been an hour. Could have been more. When we finally got back on the highway, there was no sign of him. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know if he was just messing with us or if it would have been worse if we hadn't gotten away. I think about that a lot. The only thing I know for sure is that he was never trying to pass us. I was driving home late, taking a back road through miles of empty land. No houses, no streetlights, just a 2-lane highway cutting through fields that stretched forever. The only other lights were my headlights and the occasional glow of a distant farmhouse window, too far away to matter. I almost didn't see the car on the side of the road. It was just past a bend, hazards flashing, a dark shape in the night. Someone stood next to it, waving. I slowed down without thinking, habit more than anything. It was late, and I figured someone just needed a jump or a ride to the nearest gas station. As I got closer, I saw it was a man. He had on a baseball cap and a jacket, hands in his pockets now that he saw I was pulling over. His car looked fine. No flat tire, no smoke. That was the first thing that made me pause. I rolled down my window just a little. Everything all right? The guy leaned in, trying to see inside my car. Yeah, man. Appreciate you stopping. Car just died on me. His voice was calm, easygoing, but something about him made my skin crawl. He wasn't acting the way people usually do when they're stranded. No urgency, no frustration. He wasn't looking at his car. He was looking at me. I glanced at his vehicle again. The headlights were off, but the hazards blinked steadily. There was nothing obviously wrong with it. And then I saw something else. The back door, on the opposite side of the car, was open just a crack. I don't know why, but that made my stomach drop. Maybe because I hadn't seen anyone else in the car. Maybe because I suddenly had the feeling that if I got out, I wouldn't be getting back in. "Where you headed?" he asked. The way he said it didn't sound like small talk. It sounded like he was trying to get me to say something specific. Like he was waiting to hear an answer that would help him decide something. I forced a shrug. Just passing through. His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Yeah. Where you coming from?" It was wrong. The whole thing was wrong. He wasn't asking for help anymore. He was asking questions. Stalling. And then I saw it. A shadow moved behind his car. Low to the ground. Fast. There was someone else. Someone hiding. My hands clenched on the wheel. My car was still in drive. Foot on the brake. The man was watching me, his head tilted just a little, like he knew I'd seen something. "Think I left my phone in the car," I said, reaching for the gear shift. "I'll call someone for you." His face didn't change, but his whole body tensed. Just a little. Just enough. And then he lunged. I slammed my foot on the gas before he even touched the handle. Tires screamed against the pavement as I swerved back onto the road. My heart was in my throat, hands shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. In the mirror, I saw him standing in the road, just watching me go. The other shape, the one that had been behind the car, was standing now too. A second man. Taller. I drove fast, faster than I should have, until the blinking lights of his hazard signals disappeared behind me. I didn't slow down. Not until I hit the next town, miles away, where there were gas stations and neon signs and people. I pulled into a lot and sat there, breathing hard, gripping the wheel. I looked at my doors. Locked. Checked the back seat. Empty. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he had waited on that dark road. The way he had smiled, just a little, when I hesitated. The way his friend had been crouched, out of sight, waiting for me to step out. His car wasn't broken. It was bait. It started out like any other trip to the store. I needed to grab some groceries, so I decided to head to the local supermarket. I went in around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, thinking it would be a quick and uneventful stop. I wasn't in any rush, just picking up things I needed for the week. I noticed him right away, the man who was walking just a little too closely behind me in the aisles. It wasn't like he was standing directly behind me, but enough to make me uncomfortable. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It happens sometimes when you're alone in public spaces, right? You notice people, and sometimes your mind starts to play tricks on you. I moved through the aisles, picking up things off the shelves, and every time I turned around, he was still there, a few steps behind me. I went to the canned goods section, and he followed me there too. I tried to tell myself that maybe we were just going through the same aisles, that maybe we were on the same schedule. But the feeling in my stomach didn't go away. It kept twisting, like something wasn't quite right. I decided to test it. I walked quickly to the other end of the aisle, pretending to be distracted by something on the shelf. I glanced over my shoulder. Sure enough, he was still there, walking at the same pace, following me. I tried not to panic. People often don't mean anything by it. Maybe he was just shopping. But why couldn't I shake the feeling that he was keeping just a little too close to me? I decided to make a turn into the frozen food section, hoping I could get some space. As I walked around the corner, I glanced back again. This time, I caught him looking directly at me. His eyes locked on mine for just a second, and I quickly turned away, pretending to focus on the frozen meals in front of me. My pulse started to pick up. This wasn't right. I was starting to feel trapped. I went through the next few aisles, and every time I glanced over, he was still there. It was like he was attached to me. At one point, I turned into an aisle that was empty, thinking maybe I could lose him. I didn't see him for a moment, and I thought I had finally managed to escape. But as I reached for a box of cereal, I felt someone standing behind me again. I turned around quickly, and there he was, just standing there, looking at me. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. He didn't look dangerous, but there was something off about him. Something that made my stomach churn. His smile was a little too wide, his eyes a little too cold. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, looking at me, and it felt like an eternity. Then, finally, he spoke. "You don't look like you're from around here," he said. I didn't know how to respond, so I just mumbled something about living in the area. He nodded, like he was satisfied with my answer, and walked away. But he didn't leave the aisle. He just walked to the other end of it and turned back around. I didn't know what to do. My heart was beating so loudly, I felt like everyone in the store could hear it. I quickly grabbed what I needed and made my way to the front of the store. I just wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of there before anything worse happened. I tried to keep my head down as I moved towards the exit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I glanced around as I pushed through the sliding doors, and there he was, standing just inside, watching me. I froze for a second, my breath catching in my throat. I thought I had lost him. But no! He was still there. I quickly walked to my car, hoping to get away from him as fast as possible. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my keys. I got to the car, unlocked the door, and just as I was about to slide into the driver's seat, I heard footsteps behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned, and there he was, standing at the edge of the parking lot, a few feet away from my car. He was just standing there, not moving, staring at me with that same unnerving smile. My breath caught in my throat. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice casual, like nothing was wrong. Like he wasn't standing there in a parking lot, blocking my way. I wanted to scream. I wanted to do something, anything, but I was frozen. I just stared at him for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide what to do next. He didn't make any move to approach me, but he wasn't leaving either. I didn't want to make any sudden moves, didn't want to do anything that might set him off. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get away. Then, finally, after what felt like forever, he turned and walked back toward the entrance of the store, never looking back. I don't know why he left. Maybe he lost interest, or maybe he saw someone else in the parking lot. I don't know. I didn't wait to find out. I quickly got into my car, locked the doors, and drove out of the parking lot without looking back. The rest of the drive home was a blur. My mind kept racing, my thoughts jumping from one thing to the next. I kept thinking about how close he had been, how he had followed me, how he hadn't left until I was almost trapped in that parking lot. I've thought about it every day since then. I can't shake the feeling that something was off about that whole situation. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just some weird guy, but I can't shake the thought that it could have been worse if I hadn't gotten away. I haven't been back to that store since, and I don't think I will anytime soon. Every time I drive by, I get that same feeling, like he's still out there, watching me. I was in the library that night, as usual, trying to get through a mountain of reading for my classes. It was around 10 p.m., and most people had already left. The library is open late, but it tends to get quiet after a certain hour. I like it that way. The atmosphere helps me focus better when I'm working. It was just me, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, and a few others scattered around, sitting at their tables, probably doing the same thing as me, cramming for exams. I had my spot picked out in the back corner. It's a little secluded, which is perfect for me. I like the peace and quiet. I'd been there for a couple of hours already, my books and notes spread out, coffee beside me, trying to stay awake while studying for my final exam. My focus was on my notes, not really paying attention to the rest of the room. At some point, I felt someone sit down at the table across from me. It didn't bother me at first. It was a library, after all, and there were a few other people still there, too. But then I noticed this guy. He was older than me, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, but I didn't think much of it. He didn't seem out of place at first. He just sat down and started reading a book, or at least pretending to. After a while, I felt his eyes on me. I tried to ignore it. Sometimes you just feel like someone's staring at you, but they aren't. It happens. But then it happened again. And again. And then I couldn't avoid it anymore. I looked up at him, catching his eye for just a second. He didn't look away. Instead, he smiled at me. It wasn't a big, friendly smile. It was more of a little smirk. I didn't know how to respond, so I just looked back down at my book, hoping he'd stop. But he didn't. He cleared his throat, and then he spoke, his voice low, almost too casual for how late it was. "You studying for something important?" he asked. I was a bit caught off guard but tried to stay polite. "Yeah, my final exam for philosophy," I said, not really wanting to get into it. But then he leaned forward slightly, making the space between us feel even smaller. "Philosophy, huh? That sounds tough. What's the hardest part about it?" he asked, as if he was genuinely interested. I thought it was odd that a random stranger in the library would ask me something like that, but I didn't want to be rude. "The theories, I guess. They get complicated. You know, figuring out what all these philosophers are really trying to say." He nodded like he was taking it all in, but then his question shifted. "Do you study alone a lot, or do you have a group?" He asked it in a way that made it sound like he was just making conversation, but something about the tone of his voice felt off. Like he wasn't really interested in my studies at all. "Mostly alone," I answered quickly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced around the library, looking for someone else, anyone else, to distract me from this weird conversation. There were a few people nearby, but no one seemed to notice what was going on. But he didn't seem to pick up on my discomfort. Instead, he leaned in just a little more, crossing his arms on the table. "You live alone?" he asked, his voice a little quieter, as if it was now something more personal than academic. I froze for a second. My mind raced, trying to come up with a polite way to get out of this conversation. But I didn't want to cause a scene. So I just nodded, trying to keep my voice even. "Yeah, I do." He stared at me, and there was something unsettling in his gaze. It wasn't the kind of look you get from someone who's just making small talk. It was too intense, too focused, like he was analyzing me. "That must get lonely," he said softly, his words lingering in the air between us. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't know what to say, so I kept quiet, hoping he would get the hint and leave me alone. But instead, he kept talking. "What's your name?" he asked. I hesitated, not wanting to give him too much information. But I didn't want to be rude either. So I gave him my first name, as if that was all he needed. "I'm John," he said, still watching me closely. There was a pause, and I could feel my heart start to race a little. The air between us felt thick, like something was about to happen. I could feel the weight of his gaze, and I didn't know what he was thinking. "I bet you've got some interesting things to say about life, huh?" he asked, and this time, his voice was even softer, almost like he was trying to get under my skin. It wasn't a casual question anymore. It felt like he was trying to pull something from me, like he was trying to make me feel like I owed him something. I felt like I needed to get out of there. I should get back to my studying," I said, pushing my books together. I stood up quickly, grabbing my things. But before I could turn away, he reached out and placed his hand on the table in front of me, just barely stopping me. "Come on, don't go yet," he said, his voice suddenly firmer. "I've got a few more questions for you. You can't just leave me hanging after all this." Something about his voice made the hairs on my neck stand up, and for the first time that night, I felt real fear. I looked around the library again. There were a few people still there, but no one seemed to be paying attention to us. The silence around us made everything feel so much worse. I really need to go," I said, my voice trembling just slightly. I took a step back, trying to move away from the table. But he didn't let go. His eyes narrowed. "You can't just walk away," he said, his voice low and cold now. "Not after you've been talking to me like this." I felt my heart race. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt frozen. I didn't know what to do. What if he followed me out? What if he didn't let me go? In that moment, I just knew I had to get away. Without thinking, I yanked my arm away from the table, grabbed my bag, and walked as quickly as I could toward the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't care if he was still watching me. I just wanted to get out of that library, away from him, as fast as possible. As soon as I stepped outside, I felt the weight lift off my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my body. I didn't know if he was still in the library or if he followed me out, but I didn't look. I just walked straight to my car, got in, and drove home, barely remembering the drive. I didn't go back to that library for a while. Every time I thought about it, I felt sick. I couldn't shake the memory of his voice, his questions, the way he wouldn't let me go. I went to the grocery store last week, just like I always do. It was a normal day, nothing strange, and I wasn't in a hurry. I parked near the back of the lot because it was crowded, but that didn't bother me. I kind of like to walk, it gives me a moment to breathe before diving into errands. The store was busy, so it took me a little longer than usual to get everything I needed. When I came out, it was starting to get dark. The street lights in the parking lot were on, but they didn't do much. You know that kind of half-light where you can see, but everything feels off? That's how it was. I walked to my car with my bags in hand, not thinking about much, just going through the motions. I noticed a piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper when I got close. It was one of those bright yellow flyers, the kind you'd expect to see for a car wash or some event. At first, I didn't even think it was odd. People leave stuff like that all the time. I set my bags in the back seat and walked around to grab the flyer. It was stuck under the wiper pretty good, so I had to tug at it. While I was pulling it free, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the kind you hear from far away, but close, too close. I froze for a second, just holding the flyer, and then I turned my head. There was a man standing there, maybe a few feet away. He wasn't holding anything, didn't look like he worked there, and he didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, staring at me. He looked normal enough, jeans, a jacket, dark hair, but something about the way he was standing made me feel like I was in trouble. "Hey," he said finally, his voice calm but low. "You need help with something?" I shook my head. "No, I'm good. Thanks." My voice came out steadier than I felt, but my heart was starting to race. He wasn't smiling or anything, just looking at me like he was waiting for something. I tried to brush it off, turned back to my car, and tossed the flyer into the passenger seat. When I reached for the door handle, I felt his hand grab my arm. Not rough, but firm, like he'd done it before. My first instinct was to pull away, but he was strong. "You're coming with me," he said. Still calm, still too quiet. His tone made my stomach turn. "No, I'm not," I managed to say, yanking harder. I was starting to panic now, and my mind was racing. He didn't look angry or frustrated, just determined. Like he already knew how this was going to go. I didn't even see the van until he started pulling me toward it. It was parked just a few spaces down from my car, one of those older white ones with no windows in the back. The kind you see on TV and know to avoid. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint, but I knew I couldn't let him get me in that van. I screamed. Loud. As loud as I could. I didn't care who heard, I just needed someone to notice. He didn't flinch, just kept pulling me toward the van like my screaming didn't matter. That scared me more than anything because it felt like he'd done this before, like he knew how to handle it. I kicked at him, struggled, tried to twist free, but his grip didn't loosen. He was dragging me now, my feet barely staying under me. The van's side door was open, and I could see the inside, a mess of blankets, rope, and something that looked like duct tape. My mind was screaming at me to fight harder, but I felt so weak, like I wasn't strong enough to stop him. Then I remembered my keys. They were in my pocket, and I reached for them blindly, my fingers shaking so much it took me a second to get them out. I didn't think, just swung my arm and jabbed the sharp end of the key into his hand as hard as I could. He yelled. For the first time, he made a noise, and his grip loosened just enough for me to wrench free. I stumbled backward, almost falling, but I caught myself and ran. I didn't look back, didn't even think. I just ran toward the store, where I could see people coming in and out. I was yelling for help, my voice shaking, and a couple of people turned to look. A man near the entrance came toward me, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain, but I could barely get the words out. He tried to grab me. Over there. By my car. The guy didn't hesitate. He turned and started walking toward the parking lot, yelling something like, "Hey, you stay there." I followed behind him, but when we got back to my car, the man and the van were gone. My groceries were still in the back seat, my keys on the ground where I dropped them. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely pick them up. The guy who'd come to help me stayed with me until the police arrived. I filed a report, told them everything I could remember, but they didn't seem too hopeful. They said they checked the security cameras, but I haven't heard anything back yet. I still don't know who he was or why he picked me. All I know is that I've never been so scared in my life, and I'll never park in the back of a lot again. It started about a month after I moved into the duplex. I wasn't paying much attention at first because I was juggling work and my son, Ethan. He's 6, and it's just the two of us since his dad and I split. We'd moved into the place because the rent was manageable, and it was close to his school and my job. The first thing I noticed was the back door. I always locked it before leaving for work, always. One morning, I came back from dropping Ethan off and found it unlocked. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Life's busy, right? But it kept happening. One day, I found a sticky note on the fridge. It was a generic yellow square, but it wasn't mine. It just said, "Nice place." I didn't know what to make of it. Ethan didn't know how to write well enough to leave it, and he hadn't even been home that day. I threw it away, thinking it was a prank or maybe something that had somehow stuck from a store or something weird. I didn't want to overthink it. Then other things started showing up. A pen on the table I didn't recognize, a mug on the counter I was sure I hadn't put there. I started asking Ethan if he'd been playing with anything, but he just looked confused and said no. A week later, I found a note folded into my work bag. It just said, "You're doing great." I should have felt comforted, I guess, but my stomach dropped. Who writes something like that and leaves it where I definitely see it? I thought maybe a coworker had slipped it in, but I didn't bring that bag inside work. It stayed in the car. I started double-checking all the locks. The front door, back door, the windows. I'd even prop a chair against the door at night. But it didn't help. I'd come home and find little things moved, cushions off the couch, shoes lined up differently. The worst was the laundry. I don't have a dryer, so I hang things up in the small laundry room by the kitchen. One afternoon, I found Ethan's school uniform folded perfectly on the counter. I hadn't folded it. I started looking at the neighbors differently. Most of them kept to themselves, but the guy in the other half of the duplex stood out. His name was Mike, and he'd introduced himself when I moved in. He seemed nice, but he was nosy. He always made comments about when I left or came back. "Early start today, huh? Or you're home late." At first, I thought he was just being friendly, but now I wondered if he was paying too much attention. One night, I heard creaking downstairs. Ethan was asleep, and I was in bed, but the sound made me sit straight up. It was subtle, like someone trying to move quietly. I grabbed my phone and texted Mike. He replied immediately, saying he was out of town. That's when I really started panicking. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in my room with a kitchen knife, listening to every sound until the sun came up. The next day, I called a locksmith. He changed the locks on both doors, and I felt a little better. For about a week, everything seemed normal. Then I found another note. It was tucked into Ethan's favorite book on the shelf in the living room. It said, "Cute kid." I took Ethan to my mom's that night. I couldn't stay there, not knowing what was going on. I reported it to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. There was no sign of forced entry, no real evidence of a crime. Just keep an eye out, they said. I decided to set up cameras. Cheap ones I bought online, but they worked. I placed one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one at the back door. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mike. The first few nights, nothing happened. Then, on the third night, I saw him. Mike. He used a key. He walked into my house like it was his. He didn't even look around, just went straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed a soda. Then he sat on my couch and watched TV. My TV. I didn't even know what to do. I felt sick watching it. He got up after about half an hour, went into the laundry room, and just stood there, looking at the clothes on the rack. Then he left. I called the police again and showed them the footage. They took it seriously this time. They came out and arrested him. Turned out he'd made a copy of the key before I moved in. He'd lived in my half of the duplex before me and still had access. They found other keys at his place, and notes he'd written, detailed ones about me and Ethan, our schedules, what we ate, what time I went to bed. It's been months, and I still can't sleep well. I moved out a week after it happened. Ethan doesn't know the full story, and I don't plan on telling him. I just want to forget it, but I don't think I ever will. Knowing someone was in my space, watching us, touching our things. It's something I can't shake. It was late, maybe around 9 or 10 p.m., when my car broke down on Route 17. I was headed back home after visiting my sister, and it was one of those stretches of highway with nothing but fields and trees on either side. The nearest town was at least 20 miles back, and my phone had barely a single bar of service. I was trying not to panic, but the thought of sitting there all night wasn't exactly comforting. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like I knew what I was looking at. I didn't. Everything seemed fine to me, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was new, and I had gas, so I couldn't figure out what the problem was. I tried calling for roadside assistance, but the call wouldn't go through. That's when I saw the headlights. They came up slow, like whoever was driving was being careful. I stood by my car, waving my arms to make sure they saw me. A truck pulled over to the side, an older model, maybe from the 80s or 90s. The driver got out, a tall man with a thick build, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had a calm, steady way about him. "You all right?" he asked, his voice deep and even. "My car just died," I said. "I can't figure out what's wrong, and my phone's not working." He nodded and walked over to my car without another word. He leaned over the engine, fiddling with a couple of things while I stood off to the side. After a minute, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Looks like it might be the fuel pump," he said. "You're not going anywhere tonight." I felt my stomach drop. "What should I do?" "Well," he said, "I've got a garage not far from here. I can tow you there, take a closer look." I hesitated. Something about him made me uneasy, but I didn't have many options. It was either him or wait for someone else to come by, and who knew how long that would take. "All right," I said finally. He went back to his truck and pulled out a tow chain, hooking it up to my car. The whole time, he didn't say much. I tried to make small talk, asking if he lived nearby, but his answers were short, almost clipped. The ride to his garage wasn't long, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt longer. We turned off the main road onto a dirt path that wound through the trees. There weren't any lights except for his headlights, and the further we went, the darker it got. I started to regret my decision, but it was too late to back out. The garage was a small, run-down building with peeling paint and a single overhead light that flickered. He unhooked my car and waved me toward the entrance. "Come on in," he said. "I'll take a look." I followed him inside, and my unease grew. The place was cluttered with old tools, car parts, and a thick layer of dust. There was a smell, too oil mixed with something sour. He motioned for me to sit on a worn-out chair near the wall while he pulled the hood of my car open again. I tried to stay calm, but the way he moved felt off. He wasn't really looking at the engine, just sort of going through the motions. I noticed his eyes darting toward me every so often, like he was checking to see if I was watching him. "Do you have any family nearby?" he asked suddenly. "No," I said. "Why?" "Just making conversation," he said, his tone flat. I shifted in my seat, feeling the tension in the air. I glanced toward the door, calculating how far I'd have to run to get to it if something went wrong. He closed the hood and turned to face me. "Fuel pump shot," he said. "I can order the part, but it'll take a day or two." "I can call someone to pick me up," I said, standing. "Thanks for your help." "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold now. "Your phone doesn't work, remember?" I froze. The way he said it wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. I forced myself to smile, trying to act like I wasn't scared. "I'll just wait outside," I said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You're staying here," he said. "It's not safe out there at night." My heart was pounding now. I tried to step around him, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, and his eyes had a strange intensity. "Let go of me," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't. Instead, he pulled me back toward the chair and pushed me into it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I didn't wait to see what he meant. I twisted out of his grip and ran for the door. He shouted something behind me, but I didn't stop. I made it outside and sprinted toward the trees. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel. He was faster than I expected, and I knew I couldn't outrun him. I spotted a thick cluster of bushes and dove into them, crouching low and trying to quiet my breathing. He stopped nearby, his footsteps slowing. I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and angry. He walked past my hiding spot, and I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore before I moved. I crept through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. I ran toward the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver was an older woman, and she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She didn't ask questions, just told me to get in. She drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They found my car at the garage, but the man was gone. They said the place had been abandoned for years, and they'd had reports of strange activity in the area before. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again. It was a little after midnight when I got to the gym. I had a long day at work, and I wanted to blow off some steam. The place was mostly empty, which wasn't unusual for that time. There was one guy on a treadmill when I arrived, but he left after about 20 minutes. By then, It was just me. I liked the quiet. I didn't have to wait for machines, and I didn't have to deal with anyone taking up space by scrolling on their phone. The gym wasn't huge, just a single floor with a weight section in one corner and cardio machines in another. The locker rooms were in the back, and there was a staff desk near the entrance. I did my usual routine, some bench presses, a bit of time on the rowing machine, and a lot of focus on the free weights. I lost track of time, like I always do. It was probably close to 2 a.m. when I decided to wrap up. My arms were sore, and I figured I'd done enough for the night. When I grabbed my water bottle and towel, I noticed the place was eerily quiet. More than usual. I hadn't seen the staff member in a while, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes they'd step out for a smoke or to grab something from the back office. I walked to the front door, but when I pushed, it didn't budge. It was one of those heavy glass doors with a magnetic lock that needed a keycard to open. I assumed my keycard just hadn't scanned properly, so I swiped it again. The reader beeped, but the door stayed shut. I tried a few more times, each swipe followed by the same beep, but the lock didn't release. I looked around for the staff member, but the desk was empty. I knocked on the door in case they were outside. No one came. My phone was in my gym bag, so I pulled it out to call the number posted near the desk. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I told myself it was a glitch. Maybe the system was down, and the staff had stepped out. I tried to stay calm. I figured I'd wait a bit and they'd come back. I sat on one of the benches near the free weights and scrolled through my phone to distract myself. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, almost like I imagined it. A heavy breath, slow and deliberate. It came from somewhere near the back of the gym. I froze, straining my ears to listen. For a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the air conditioning. Then it came again. Louder this time. I turned toward the sound, staring into the dark corner near the locker rooms. The lights in that area were dimmer than the rest of the gym, but I could just make out the shapes of the lockers and the doorway leading to the bathrooms. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just silence. I stood up, every muscle in my body tensed. I told myself it was probably just the air vents or something falling over in the locker room. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I took a few steps toward the back, my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. "Is someone there?" I asked. This time, I heard movement. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. They echoed through the empty gym, coming from the direction of the locker rooms. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around, looking for something to defend myself with. The best I could find was one of the metal dumbbells. I grabbed it, the cold weight steadying my shaking hands. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a staff member playing a prank. Maybe someone had snuck in and was messing with me. Or maybe it was something worse. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark corner. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A laugh. Low and quiet, almost a chuckle. It didn't sound right. There was no humor in it, just something wrong. I backed away, keeping the dumbbell raised in front of me. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice cracking. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The call connected, and I told the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone, but it might take a while since I was in a more remote area of the city. I kept the operator on the line as I moved toward the front of the gym. I could still see the dark corner out of the corner of my eye, but whoever was there hadn't moved again. The operator told me to stay on the line and try to find a safe place to wait. The staff desk had a small storage cabinet underneath. I crouched down and wedged myself inside, trying to make as little noise as possible. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, whispering updates to the operator. Then the footsteps started again. Slow and steady, moving closer to the front of the gym. I clutched the dumbbell tighter, my breath shallow and fast. The operator was saying something, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could hear was the sound of those steps. They stopped right in front of the desk. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look down and see me. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I was sure they could hear it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. They headed toward the glass doors. I peeked out from the cabinet, just enough to see a figure standing there. The light from the street lamps outside cast their shadow across the floor. They stood there for a moment, their back to me. Then they turned their heads slightly, like they were listening for something. I ducked back into the cabinet, squeezing my eyes shut. A loud bang echoed through the gym. I jumped, hitting my head on the top of the cabinet. It was the front door. The figure was slamming their shoulder against it, trying to break it open. I told the operator what was happening, my voice barely more than a whisper. They assured me the police were on their way. The banging stopped, and the silence was worse than the noise. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time moving toward the weight section. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the silence. The figure froze, then bolted toward the back of the gym. I stayed in the cabinet until I heard the sound of voices calling out, telling me it was safe to come out. The police found no one in the gym. Whoever it was must have slipped out through an emergency exit before they arrived. They checked the security footage, but the cameras in the back corner had been tampered with. I haven't been back to that gym since. I canceled my membership the next day. Now, every time I hear footsteps behind me, I feel that same icy fear, like they're still there, just waiting. I've been trying to put this into words for months now, but every time I start, I can't seem to get it right. I still don't know exactly what happened, but I know what I saw and what I felt. It's not something I'll ever forget. It started like any other camping trip. A couple of friends and I went to a spot we'd been to before. A quiet, remote place in the woods, far enough from civilization to feel like we were in the middle of nowhere, but not too far that we'd have trouble getting out if we needed to. The weather was perfect. The campfire was warm. We spent the first day setting up, hiking around a bit, and just relaxing. It felt like a much-needed break from everything. The next morning, we decided to gather firewood. We hadn't prepared enough the night before, and we didn't want to run out by the time the sun set. So, I volunteered to go out alone. I figured it would be a good chance to stretch my legs and get some alone time. We weren't that far from camp, and I had a good idea of the area. It was just a short walk through the trees, grab a few fallen branches, and head back. I left the camp and started walking through the woods. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that only nature can have. There was a slight breeze rustling the leaves, and I could hear the distant sounds of birds, but nothing that felt out of place. I wasn't thinking about much, just enjoying the peace and the routine of it. I'd done this countless times before on camping trips, so there was no reason to be concerned. I walked for about 15 minutes, deeper than I usually did, but I had seen plenty of fallen branches along the way, and I figured it'd be easy to pick up a good amount. After gathering a few, I started turning back. That's when I heard it. A snap. A branch breaking in the distance. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make me stop in my tracks. I looked around, trying to see where it had come from, but the woods were thick and the trees were close together. It was hard to tell if it was just an animal or something else. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I turned and started walking back, but now I was moving faster, my eyes scanning the trees. My breath started to pick up, but I tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept walking, looking over my shoulder now and then, but I didn't see anyone. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was being paranoid. Then I heard footsteps. Not the quiet shuffle of an animal, but the unmistakable sound of someone walking through the woods, heavy, deliberate steps. They were getting closer. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here? There shouldn't have been anyone else. This area was remote. The chances of meeting another person were slim. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I needed to get back to camp. I turned and started running, not looking back, just focusing on the path ahead. I could hear the footsteps behind me, now quickening, almost as if they were chasing me. I felt my breath catching in my throat as I pushed myself harder, running faster than I ever had through the uneven terrain. My mind was racing, and I could feel the panic building. Suddenly, I stumbled. My foot caught on something, and I fell hard to the ground, my hands scraping against the rough earth. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, too close. My breath was coming in short, frantic gasps as I scrambled to my feet, and that's when I heard a voice. Low, almost a growl. Don't run. The voice was closer now, just a few feet behind me. I didn't wait to see who it was. I just took off again, my legs burning as I pushed through the pain, not daring to look back. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, branches reaching out like hands, trying to stop me. I could hear the footsteps still, right behind me, and then I felt a hand grabbing my shoulder. It yanked me backward, and I went down hard again, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. I barely had time to react before I felt the person on top of me, their weight pinning me down. I fought. I kicked, I scratched, anything to get free, but the person's grip was strong. They were trying to hold me, their hand closing around my throat, and I could feel the pressure tightening. I gasped for air, my vision starting to blur, and I thought for a second that I wasn't going to make it out of there. But then something changed. The person shifted, just for a second, and I was able to break free. I don't know how, but I managed to roll out from under them and scramble to my feet. My head was spinning, my body weak from the panic and the adrenaline, but I didn't stop. I ran again, hearing the footsteps behind me, but this time I didn't let up. I couldn't. I finally broke through the tree line, and I saw the camp in the distance. I could barely hear the footsteps anymore, but I didn't care. I kept running, pushing myself harder, until I reached the camp. I collapsed into the dirt, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked behind me, but there was no one following. I don't know how I got away, but somehow I had. I told my friends what happened as best as I could, but they didn't fully understand the fear that was still gripping me. They thought maybe I had just gotten spooked or lost my footing, but I knew what had happened. Whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen. I don't know if they were trying to rob me, hurt me, or something else, but I know I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted through those woods. We packed up and left that evening, and I never went back to that spot again. It wasn't just the fear of what had happened, there was something else. Something in the woods that day that I can't quite put into words, but I'll never forget. To this day, I don't know who or what I ran from, but I'm sure of one thing: I wasn't alone out there. Not for a second. It was supposed to be a normal evening. I had just gotten off work, the rain was coming down heavy, and I was in a rush to get home. I don't even remember why, but I needed to get out of there quickly. I had parked at the bottom of a steep hill in the city, right near an old apartment building with this narrow, slippery staircase leading up to the street. The kind of staircase you walk down when you're rushing, hoping not to slip and fall. I wasn't paying enough attention, honestly. My mind was all over the place, thinking about work, about the drive home, about what I still had to do. It was dark, the street lamps were flickering in the rain, and I couldn't even see clearly. I stepped onto the first stair, and that's when I felt the slickness beneath my foot. Before I knew it, my foot shot out from under me. I tried to catch myself, but the next thing I knew, I was tumbling down the rest of the stairs. My body hit every step like a sack of potatoes. I heard the sickening thud of my head hitting the stone, the way it bounced off the wet steps. My arms and legs felt like they were made of rubber, and I was too disoriented to make sense of what was happening. I think I lost consciousness for a second. I remember seeing flashes of light and hearing distant noises before everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on my back, soaked from head to toe, the cold rain splashing in my face. I could barely move. My whole body felt like it had been hit by a truck. The taste of blood was in my mouth, and I couldn't remember where I was or how long I'd been out. My head was pounding. Slowly, I blinked a few times, trying to focus. That's when I noticed them. There were people standing around me, looking down at me. I tried to lift my head, but my neck was stiff, and I could barely keep my eyes open. They weren't rushing to help me. They weren't even concerned about the fact that I had just fallen down the stairs and might be seriously hurt. They just stared at me. The first thing I noticed was the guy closest to me. He was wearing a rain-soaked jacket, his hood pulled up over his head. His face was partially hidden, but I could see his eyes were darting around nervously, like he was expecting something or someone to show up. There were two others standing behind him, one tall and thin, the other short with a thick coat. Neither of them said anything, but they were watching me intently. The guy closest to me kneeled down. "Hey, you all right?" His voice wasn't kind. It wasn't concerned. It was flat, almost bored. I tried to speak, but my mouth felt numb, like I was drunk. I couldn't make a sound. I just lay there, unable to move, feeling the cold rain against my skin and the pain in my head. The guy didn't seem to care. He reached into my pocket without warning, and before I could even react, he pulled out my wallet. I tried to sit up. My body screamed at me to stop, but I pushed through the pain, my head spinning, trying to focus on what was happening. "Hey," I managed to croak, "give it back." The guy didn't even look up at me. He opened my wallet and started flipping through it. I could barely see, but I noticed my credit cards, my ID, everything. My breath was shallow. I knew something wasn't right. These people weren't here to help me. They didn't care about the fact that I had just fallen down a flight of stairs in the rain. They cared about my wallet. "Hey," I said, "give it back," I repeated, my voice shaking with anger and fear. My fingers were still stiff, but I managed to move one hand, weakly reaching out to grab my wallet. The tall guy behind him, who hadn't spoken a word until then, stepped forward. He had a sharp look in his eyes, and his face was completely expressionless. He reached out, pushing my hand away with a little more force than I expected. "Stay down," he said, his voice cold. I tried to protest, but my head throbbed, and the world spun around me. Everything felt distant, like I wasn't even in my own body. I just kept watching them, struggling to make sense of what was happening. They weren't trying to help. They weren't trying to call for an ambulance or ask if I was okay. They were just waiting, watching me suffer. The guy with my wallet, who had been rifling through it, suddenly pulled out my cash. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I saw him slide the bills into his jacket pocket with a sly grin on his face. Then, he dropped the wallet back onto my chest like it was nothing. "You should have been more careful," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Not a good idea to be out here all alone in the rain, huh?" I couldn't believe what was happening. I tried to push myself up, but I was still too disoriented. My arms were shaking. I wanted to fight back, but my body wasn't working right. My legs felt like they were made of stone. All I could do was watch them. The tall guy crouched next to me, looking down at me with a strange expression. I couldn't tell if he was amused or annoyed. "You should just stay still," he said, his voice low. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The short guy, who had been standing quietly until then, started moving around, like he was looking for something. He went through my car, checking the doors, peering inside like he was searching for more things to steal. The rain was coming down harder now, but these guys didn't seem to care at all. I was terrified, feeling helpless and trapped. There were 3 of them, and I was alone on this dark, rainy street, barely able to move. I couldn't think straight, but I knew I had to get away, somehow. I had to make it stop. I started shouting, my voice cracking. "Call the police." I screamed, but it came out as barely a whisper. They just looked at each other, like they were deciding what to do with me next. My heart raced, and panic began to set in. Finally, the guy who had been rummaging through my stuff stood up. He took one last look at me before stepping back, pulling something out of his pocket. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when I saw the glint of a knife, my stomach turned. I didn't know if he was going to use it on me or just threaten me, but I didn't want to find out. I heard the man mutter something, but it was lost in the roar of the rain. I couldn't stay there. I had to get up. I had to move. Using every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself off the wet ground. My legs were still weak, but I stumbled, managing to get to my feet. They watched me, but none of them moved. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I backed up, slowly, toward my car. They didn't stop me. I fumbled for my keys, my hand shaking as I unlocked the door and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut, my hands still trembling, and I sped off without looking back. I don't know why they didn't follow me, or why they didn't do anything else, but I didn't stop until I was out of that area and into the nearest gas station, where I stayed inside, my hands still shaking. I'm still not sure what they wanted. All I know is they weren't there to help me. They just wanted my wallet. The rain started coming down just after I left the grocery store, heavier than I expected. I had planned to walk the 2 miles back home. It wasn't far, and I liked the fresh air, but this wasn't just a light drizzle. It was pouring, cold and relentless, soaking me through in minutes. I had no umbrella, just a bag of groceries I was now holding against my chest to keep dry. I hurried along the sidewalk, keeping my head down against the wind when I saw the bus stop up ahead. It wasn't much, just a small glass shelter with a bench inside, but it would keep the rain off. I picked up my pace, my shoes squelching with every step, and ducked under the awning with a sigh of relief. The rain hammered against the roof and the glass walls, loud and unrelenting. I was about to set my bag down and check my phone when I noticed I wasn't alone. There was someone else there, sitting on the bench, a man. He looked up when I entered, his face partially hidden by the hood of his jacket. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a blank expression. His clothes were wet, his jeans dark with rainwater, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. Something about the way he was sitting, hunched forward with his legs spread wide, made him seem bigger than he really was. I nodded to him, not sure what else to do, and stood off to the side, leaning against the glass. There wasn't much room under the awning, and I didn't want to crowd him. The rain was coming in sideways, though, and the wind kept blowing it against my legs. I shuffled closer to the center, trying to stay dry. He didn't move or look away, and I could feel his eyes on me as I adjusted my bag and wiped the water off my face. It was awkward, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just tired or cold. We were both stuck here, after all, waiting for the rain to let up. After a few minutes, he spoke. "You live around here?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The question caught me off guard. It wasn't an unusual thing to ask, but there was something about the way he said it that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated before answering, keeping my voice casual. "Yeah, not far," I said. "Just waiting out the rain." He nodded slowly, like he was thinking about that. His eyes stayed on me, unblinking. I looked away, pretending to check my phone, but the screen was too wet to work. I shoved it back in my pocket and tried to focus on the rain instead of the strange tension in the air. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said after a long pause. I glanced at him, unsure if he was trying to be helpful or threatening. His tone was flat, hard to read. I forced a small smile, not wanting to make things worse. "It's just rain," I said. "I'll be fine." He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, stretching his legs out in front of him. His boots were caked with mud, leaving streaks on the floor. He was taking up most of the space now, and I could feel the cold spray of the rain against my back as I tried to stay out of his way. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel my pulse quicken, the hairs on my neck standing up. There was something off about him, something I couldn't put into words. I thought about leaving, but the rain was still coming down hard, and I didn't want to get soaked again. Then he stood up. It wasn't a sudden movement, but it made me flinch anyway. He was taller than I'd realized, broad-shouldered and solid. He stepped closer, his hands still in his pockets, and I pressed myself against the glass, trying to keep some distance between us. "You're taking up a lot of room," he said, his voice sharper now. "I was here first." I blinked at him, confused. There was plenty of room in the shelter, enough for both of us. But the way he was looking at me, his eyes narrowing, made it clear he didn't want me there. "I'm not trying to bother you," I said carefully. "I'll stay over here." He didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit. The rain was pouring behind him, a solid wall of water. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the panic building in my chest. "I think you should go," he said, his voice cold. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to escalate things, but I also didn't want to step out into the storm, leaving myself vulnerable. "Look, I'm just waiting for the rain to stop," I said. "I'll be gone as soon as it lets up." He didn't respond. Instead, he took another step closer, and I realized just how trapped I was. The shelter was small, the glass walls offering no escape. I could see the rainwater pooling at the edges, dripping onto the floor. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low and menacing. I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. My hands tightened around my bag, the only thing I had to defend myself with. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't want any trouble." He smirked at that, a cruel twist of his lips. "Trouble?" he said, his tone mocking. "You think I'm trouble?" Before I could respond, he lunged forward, grabbing my arm. His grip was strong, his fingers digging into my skin. I tried to pull away, but he held on tight, his face inches from mine. "You need to learn some respect," he hissed. I didn't think. I swung my bag at him, the weight of the groceries knocking him off balance. He stumbled back, letting go of my arm, and I took the opportunity to push past him, running out into the rain. The cold water hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. The rain blurred everything, the streetlights casting faint glows in the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where cars were passing by, their headlights cutting through the storm. I flagged down a driver, my voice barely audible over the rain, and begged them to help. They let me in, and I explained what had happened as they drove me to safety. By the time the police arrived at the bus stop, the man was gone. I still don't know what he wanted or what he might have done if I hadn't fought back. But I can't forget the look in his eyes, the way he seemed to enjoy the fear he was causing. Now, every time it rains, I can't help but think about that night and wonder if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to cross his path. It's hard to describe the kind of fear that settled in the pit of my stomach that night, but I'll try. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special, just another long workday that dragged on forever. Around 8 p.m., the city was plunged into darkness. No lights, no street lamps, nothing. The whole place went quiet, except for the usual sounds of people moving around, shouting, cars honking, but that faded too. The whole block went silent, like everyone was holding their breath. I could hear my heartbeat loud in my ears. I had been at home by myself, nothing out of the ordinary. My roommate had gone out of town for a few days, so I was alone in the apartment. I didn't think much about it, just grabbed a flashlight and set it down on the table to be ready in case the blackout lasted longer than expected. It was a hot summer evening, and the AC was out, so it felt like the walls of the apartment were closing in. I sat by the window for a while, hoping the lights would come back on, but nothing changed. Everything was still dark. I was starting to get a little frustrated, pacing around. I needed to check on my phone for updates, but of course, the service was spotty. Just as I was about to get up and go to the kitchen, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought maybe it was just the sound of my own nerves, like the air itself was heavy. But then I realized it wasn't from the hallway or outside. It was coming from inside my apartment. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stood still for a moment, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again. Slow, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't care whether I could hear them or not. I froze. My mind raced. Was it possible that someone had gotten in during the blackout? The door was locked. I always made sure it was, especially with the city being as crazy as it was during blackouts. No one had knocked, no one had called. I hadn't heard a thing until the footsteps. The silence that followed was deafening. All I could hear was the sound of my own breath and the pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. If it was someone trying to rob me, they probably hadn't expected anyone to be home. But I wasn't about to just sit there like a sitting duck. I grabbed the flashlight and pressed my back to the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. I barely dared to breathe. I could hear the faint sound of shuffling feet, moving slowly. I couldn't tell which direction they were coming from, but they were getting closer. I waited, hoping it was some kind of mistake, maybe just the wind. But the footsteps didn't stop. I wanted to call 911. I really did. But I wasn't sure if I should. The blackout meant no phones were working properly, and I didn't know if anyone would even hear me. If someone was in my apartment, I didn't want to give away my position by talking on the phone. The seconds felt like hours, stretching out in a way I couldn't explain. I could hear the footsteps now, closer, right outside my room. I swallowed hard, trying not to make any noise. They were getting closer, and I couldn't think straight. My pulse was racing. That's when the flashlight flickered. I cursed under my breath, praying it wouldn't die completely. I didn't dare move to check the batteries. If the flashlight went out, I'd be in complete darkness, and that thought was worse than any other. My senses were on high alert. Every sound seemed amplified. I could hear my breath rasping, my hands trembling around the flashlight. I had to act. I moved quickly, staying low and as quiet as I could. I didn't know where the footsteps had gone, but I didn't want to risk staying in the open. I crept down the hallway toward the kitchen. The flashlight beam was barely enough to guide me, but it was something. I checked the back door to see if I could slip out unnoticed, but it was locked. Not a chance of getting out without being seen. I felt a surge of panic. Was this a mistake? Should I have called someone sooner? Was I being too paranoid? Just as I was about to turn back to the front door, I heard it again. This time, it was clearer, the sound of someone breathing. Not far from where I was. I froze again. The breath was heavy, deliberate, like whoever it was just waiting, listening for me. My blood turned cold. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't let them know I knew. I had to figure out what was going on, but I couldn't let myself get caught. I moved silently into the kitchen, my eyes darting around, trying to think. I knew the layout of my apartment like the back of my hand, but tonight, it felt like a maze. I didn't know if I'd make it to the phone in time or if I'd even be able to use it. I moved toward the drawer where I kept a knife. Not to fight, but to feel safe. I didn't even know what I was thinking. Maybe I was just trying to give myself some courage. That's when the door to my bedroom creaked open. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but I stayed still, keeping my breath shallow. Whoever it was moving around. They were getting closer, and I had no idea what they wanted. Maybe they were looking for something, or maybe they were just here to harm me. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, trying to keep quiet. My mind raced. What was going on? How had someone gotten in without me hearing them? What did they want from me? And then, just as suddenly as the steps had started, they stopped. Completely. I didn't know whether to breathe a sigh of relief or to stay hidden. The silence was maddening, but I dared not make a sound. I didn't even want to move, in case it made a noise. I waited. Minutes passed. I don't know how long, but it felt like hours. Finally, I made my way to the front door, grabbing my keys. I couldn't stay here any longer. I bolted out into the street, finally feeling the fresh air hit my face. I stood there, just outside my apartment, and didn't move for a while. I didn't know if it was safe to go back inside or if whoever had been in there had left. Eventually, The lights flickered back on, but I didn't go back in right away. Instead, I walked to the nearest open store, where I called my friend and told them what had happened. I was a mess, shaking, barely able to speak without feeling like I might collapse. I don't know if I was overreacting, but I didn't care anymore. I knew something had happened, and I couldn't risk going back in there alone. The police arrived shortly after I called them, but by then, there was nothing to find. No sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone having been in my apartment. The officer assured me it was probably just a weird coincidence, maybe something in the building's wiring that made strange sounds or the blackout playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that they had been in my apartment, watching me. I don't know what happened that night, and I probably won't ever find out. But after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved out of that apartment the very next week. I couldn't live there anymore, not after hearing those steps, those breaths, knowing someone had been in my home, whether they had meant to hurt me or not. It started late in the evening when I first noticed the figure outside. The rain had been pouring steadily for hours, tapping against the windows in a way that always made the house feel colder. I had been in the living room, half watching an old movie while scrolling through my phone, when something outside caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a trick of the rain, but then I saw it clearly, a person standing across the street, motionless. The yellow of their raincoat stood out sharply against the dark, wet night. They were facing the house across from mine, standing perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. Their head tilted slightly, like they were looking in the windows. I remember thinking it was strange, but not enough to do anything. People act oddly sometimes. Maybe they were waiting for someone or trying to get out of the rain for a moment. It wasn't until later that I realized I had been glancing at the clock more and more, checking to see if they'd left. They didn't. An hour passed. The figure didn't move. They stayed there, facing that house, their shoulders stiff, their hands at their sides. I turned off the movie and went to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek out. The streetlight above them flickered slightly, casting their shadow long across the pavement. The rain was heavy, but I could still see the edges of their hood and the way their head was angled toward the lit windows across the street. I told myself to stop staring. It wasn't my business. But when I looked again, they had shifted slightly. Not toward the house they'd been facing, but toward mine. That's when the uneasiness started. It wasn't much at first, just a heavy feeling in my chest like something wasn't right. I locked the front door. The thought made me feel silly, but I couldn't shake the way my fingers lingered on the deadbolt, pressing it firmly into place. By midnight, the rain had gotten worse. The water ran in streams along the curb, and the sound of it was loud enough to drown out everything else. I tried to ignore the figure outside, but every time I looked, they were still there. The way they just stood without moving made my stomach twist. I convinced myself they'd leave eventually. No one would just stand in the rain all night. But then they moved. It wasn't a lot, just a step or two, but it was enough to make me sit up straight. They were walking now, slowly, their boots splashing in the water as they crossed the street. I couldn't see their face, only the shadow of their hood, but I could feel their focus. It wasn't on the house across the street anymore. It was on mine. I didn't turn off the lights, even though I wanted to. Something about being in the dark felt worse, like I wouldn't see them coming. Instead, I stayed near the window, keeping the curtain pulled back just enough to watch. The yellow raincoat was bright even in the dim streetlight. They stopped halfway across the street and just stood there, the water pooling around their feet. The rain made it impossible to hear anything, but I swear I saw their shoulders rise and fall, like they were breathing deeply. Their head tilted again, this time toward my window. I ducked back, my heart hammering. For a while, I stayed out of sight, pacing the living room and checking the locks on every door. I told myself to call someone, anyone, but the idea of trying to explain what was happening felt ridiculous. What would I say? There's someone standing outside in a raincoat? They haven't done anything. They haven't said anything. They're just there. When I worked up the nerve to look again, they were closer. The raincoat was now at the edge of my driveway. The shadow of the hood hid their face completely, but they were angled toward the house, and I knew they were looking. My throat felt tight, my hands sweating as I gripped my phone. I couldn't take my eyes off them, afraid they'd move the second I blinked. Then they did. It was slow and deliberate. They walked up the driveway, each step heavy and sure. I backed away from the window, my stomach twisting into knots. Every instinct told me not to look, not to let them know I was watching, but I couldn't stop myself. I peeked out again and saw them standing at the edge of the porch, just feet from the door. The rain made it hard to see details, but there was something in their hand. It was long and dark, like a piece of metal. I stared at it, trying to figure out what it was, when they raised it and tapped it lightly against the door frame. The sound was muffled by the rain, but I felt it. A hollow, deliberate knock. I backed away slowly, clutching my phone. I dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm, as I stammered out what was happening. She asked if the person had tried to break in or if they were threatening me. I told her no, but I didn't know what else to say. The tapping continued, steady and unhurried. I couldn't tell if they knew I was watching or if they were just waiting. The dispatcher promised to send someone, but I couldn't stop glancing at the front door, afraid that by the time help came, it would be too late. Then, the tapping stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The rain was still pounding, masking every other sound. When I looked out the window again, they were gone. The raincoat was nowhere in sight, and the driveway was empty. For a moment, I thought they'd left. But then I heard a soft creak, not from the front door, but from the side of the house. My blood ran cold as I realized they were moving around, looking for another way in. The sound of footsteps came from the back now, slow and deliberate. I locked myself in the bathroom, my phone pressed to my ear as I whispered to the dispatcher that they were still here. She told me to stay calm, that help was on the way, but her voice felt distant, like I was underwater. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. I froze, the phone slipping from my hands. There was no knock this time, no tapping. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure they could hear it. I pressed myself against the far wall, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something to happen. Then, finally, I heard the sound of sirens. They started faint, growing louder as they approached. The footsteps retreated quickly, the sound fading into the rain. By the time the police arrived, the house was empty, and the figure in the yellow raincoat was gone. The officers searched the area, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. All that was left was a single muddy streak on the side of the house, right below the bathroom window. It had been raining for hours by the time we decided to stop for the night. The forecast had said scattered showers, but it turned into a steady downpour that turned the dirt roads into slippery paths. Our plan was simple: drive out to the woods, set up camp, and get away from everything for a weekend. It was supposed to be a break from work, stress, all that. None of us thought to check if the spot we picked was public land. It just looked like a good place to pitch a tent, and it was getting dark fast. There were 4 of us, me, Jason, Claire, and Matt. We parked near a clearing by the trees. It wasn't an official campsite, but it looked secluded and quiet. We got the tents up quickly despite the rain. The sound of the drops hitting the canvas was loud but kind of calming. After that, we sat around under a tarp Jason had brought, trying to keep the fire going with damp wood. We laughed a bit, told some stories, but we were all soaked, so the fun didn't last long. By 11, we gave up and went to bed. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The rain had lightened up, just a faint tapping against the tent now. Everything was quiet except for that. I thought maybe I had heard an animal or something, but when I listened closer, I heard voices. Low, angry voices. I unzipped the sleeping bag carefully and leaned toward the tent door, straining to hear. Jason's tent was closest to mine, and I could hear him whispering to someone. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone wasn't good. He sounded scared. Then I heard another voice, deep and sharp, cutting through the rain. "You've got no right to be here," it said. I froze. I could tell it wasn't one of us, and it was angry. I peeked through the small mesh window on the tent and saw a flashlight beam swinging around outside. It landed on Jason's face for a second, and he winced. The light moved, and then I saw him, an older man, tall and broad, wearing a camo jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. He was holding a rifle. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The man pointed the rifle at the ground near Jason's feet and barked, "You think you can just walk onto someone's property and do whatever you like? Who gave you permission?" Jason stammered something about not knowing, about it being an accident. The man didn't seem to care. His voice got louder. "An accident? You think that makes it okay? You've got 10 seconds to pack up and leave, or I'll make you leave. You hear me?" I wanted to get up, to help Jason somehow, but I was terrified. I didn't know if the man would see me as a threat or if he'd just turn the gun on me too. I stayed crouched in the tent, gripping my phone, even though I had no signal out here. Claire must have heard it too, because I saw the light from her phone flashlight flicker on in her tent. That was a mistake. The man noticed it immediately. "Who else is out here?" he shouted, swinging the rifle toward her tent. He stomped toward it, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly as he moved. "Come out. Now!" Jason tried to say something, maybe to calm him down, but the man shoved him backward. Jason stumbled and fell, landing hard in the mud. Claire unzipped her tent slowly and stepped out with her hands up, shaking. Matt's tent was still zipped shut, no movement from inside. He was either frozen like me or still asleep somehow. The man's face was pale and lined, and his eyes were wild. He waved a rifle between Jason and Claire, spitting questions. "How many of you are there? What are you doing here? You spying on me?" Claire stammered something about just camping, just passing through. The man didn't seem to believe her. He kept muttering under his breath, things like, "liars," and "think you can sneak around my land." Then he looked at her tent, then Jason's, then mine. His eyes narrowed. "There's more of you, isn't there? Come out, all of you." I didn't know what to do. If I stayed hidden, he might think we were trying to trick him, but if I came out, I didn't know what he'd do. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Finally, I unzipped the tent slowly, keeping my hands visible. I stepped out into the wet grass, my socks soaking through instantly. The man stared at me, his jaw tight. "Another one," he said, almost to himself. He pointed the rifle toward the last tent of Matt's. What about him? Before I could answer, Matt's tent unzipped. He came out with his hands up like the rest of us, his face pale and scared. The man stared at all four of us, his flashlight flickering over each of our faces. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just breathed heavily. Then he spat on the ground and said, "You've got 5 minutes. Pack up and get off my land. If I see you here again, I'll shoot first and ask questions later." None of us moved right away. He shouted, "Now," and that got us going. We scrambled to take down the tents, our hands fumbling with the wet fabric and slippery poles. The man stood there the whole time, his rifle resting on his hip, watching us with cold eyes. It took longer than 5 minutes, but he didn't stop us. He just kept muttering to himself, shaking his head like we'd done something personal to him. When we finally had everything packed, we started toward the car. Jason tried to apologize again, but the man cut him off. "Just go," he said. "And don't come back." We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the car, and Jason started it up, the tires spinning a little in the mud before catching. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the man still standing there, his flashlight beam following us until we were out of sight. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road, miles away. No one said much after that. We just sat there, soaked and shaken, the rain still pounding on the roof. We knew we'd been lucky. The man could have done a lot worse than yell at us. I still think about him sometimes, the way he looked at us, like we weren't people, just intruders. It makes me wonder what he was so afraid of or what he was hiding. I still can't shake the memory of what happened. It's been months now, but every time I close my eyes, I can see it all over again. The pain, the terror, the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I'm not sure I'll ever get over it. It was just supposed to be a quick camping trip, something simple, just to get away from the noise of the city for a weekend. I've always enjoyed the solitude of the woods, so when I found a quiet spot, I knew it'd be perfect. No one else around for miles, just the sounds of nature and the comfort of my tent. I set up my camp near a small stream and spent the day walking around, familiarizing myself with the area. It was about the third day when I decided to go off trail, just to explore a little. The woods were thick with trees, the ground soft underfoot, and it felt like the kind of place you could easily get lost in if you didn't know what you were doing. But I didn't mind. I wasn't going far, and I had a good sense of direction. My plan was simple: walk for a while, maybe find a nice spot for photos, and then head back. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. The underbrush started to thin out, and I could see the ground was uneven, almost like something had disturbed it recently. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals, maybe, or some weather erosion. But then, I stepped on something that didn't feel right underfoot. It was a rope, thin and tight, hidden beneath the leaves. Before I could process what was happening, the rope pulled, and I felt a sharp, brutal pain shoot up my leg. I screamed out and instinctively tried to pull away, but it was too late. The trap had already triggered. I looked down and saw that a thick metal clasp had closed around my ankle, the pressure unbearable, and I could feel something sharp digging into my skin. Blood was starting to drip, and I couldn't move. Panic flooded my chest, and I knew I had to get out of it, but my mind was racing. I looked around, but all I saw were trees, more trees. No one around. I tried to yank my foot free, but it was useless. The pain was almost too much to bear, and I could feel myself starting to lose control. What kind of trap was this? It wasn't a bear trap. The metal was thinner, more like something set for smaller animals, maybe a snare? But it was too heavy for something meant for an animal that small. And the fact that it was hidden so well made me think it wasn't just a hunting trap. I managed to calm myself enough to think, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I wasn't going to die here, not like this. I wasn't going to just give up. I looked around, trying to find anything that could help me. The trap was tight, and there was no way to loosen it. But there had to be a way to get out. I realized that I needed to stay calm. The more I panicked, the more it would hurt. But the longer I stayed in that spot, the more dangerous it became. I knew I was alone out here, at least, I thought I was. The woods were vast, and I was a good distance from camp. The trap could have been set by anyone. But then it hit me. I wasn't just injured. I was alone. I had no way to get help. And there was no telling who had set the trap or if they were still nearby. I tested the trap again, trying to move my leg, but it was useless. The more I moved, the worse the pain became, and I could feel the blood pooling around my ankle. I was losing time. Whoever set this trap, they could be watching me right now. Or worse, they could be coming to finish what they started. I thought about the knife I had in my pack, just a few feet away. It wasn't the best tool for the job, but it was something. It was the only thing I had. I tried to reach for it, but every movement caused the trap to tighten even more. I gritted my teeth, determined not to give in to the pain. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to get the knife. It took what felt like hours, but finally, I managed to grab the knife from my bag. I knew it wouldn't cut the metal, but maybe I could use it to loosen the mechanism somehow. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing I could think of. I struggled with it for what felt like forever, sweat pouring down my face, my breath shallow and erratic. Every second I wasted was another second closer to being completely helpless. Just as I thought I might pass out from the pain, I heard it. A snap of a twig behind me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to listen, but the forest was too quiet. I turned my head as much as I could, but I couldn't see anything. The sound was distant, but it was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I forced myself to stay still, praying that whoever it was wouldn't find me. I had no way of defending myself, and I knew if they saw me, there would be no way I could run. I had to focus on getting out of this trap, but I couldn't help but feel that someone was watching me. That they were getting closer. The minutes felt like hours. I kept hearing noises, footsteps, twigs breaking, but I couldn't see anyone. I knew whoever it was wasn't too far off. They had to know I was here. The feeling of being hunted, trapped like an animal, was overwhelming. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, each thump a reminder of how vulnerable I was. Finally, with a desperate move, I managed to use the knife to pry the trap open just enough to slide my foot out. The pain was blinding, but I didn't stop. I forced myself to stand, even though I could barely feel my leg. I didn't care. I stumbled forward, dragging myself away from the trap, my vision swimming from the pain. I had to get back to camp. I didn't care how, but I had to make it. I stumbled back to the path, trying to get back to camp. My ankle was bleeding, my whole body aching from the strain, but I couldn't stop. The thought that someone could be following me, watching me, made it impossible to slow down. Every step felt like a lifetime, but I kept going. Eventually, I made it back to camp, but the relief was short-lived. There was still the sick feeling that someone had been watching me, and I wasn't sure I was safe yet. I don't know who set the trap, or if they were still out there, but I didn't stay another night to find out. I packed up as quickly as I could, ignoring the pain in my leg, and drove straight back to the nearest town. It's been weeks, but I still feel like someone's watching me when I'm alone in the woods. I haven't gone back, and I don't think I ever will. I always liked running early in the morning. It was quiet, the air felt fresh, and the streets were mostly empty. My usual route took me through a small park about a mile from my apartment. It wasn't big, just a couple of winding paths, some benches, and a lot of trees, but it was peaceful, especially at that time of day. I'd been running there for months and never had any issues. That morning felt like any other. It was just past 5:30 a.m., and the sun was barely starting to rise. I had my usual playlist going, the one I always used to get into a rhythm. The streets were still dark, and the only people I saw were the occasional dog walkers or another runner here and there. When I reached the park, I turned onto the main path, letting my feet fall into their usual pace. I noticed him about halfway through the park. He was standing near a bench, just off the path. At first, I thought he was waiting for someone. He wasn't doing anything, no phone, no dog, nothing. Just standing there, looking straight ahead. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about the way he stood caught my attention. Too still. Too rigid. I kept running, telling myself not to overthink it. Plenty of people use the park, and not everyone looks friendly first thing in the morning. As I got closer, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He wasn't looking straight ahead anymore. He was looking at me. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept going. I didn't slow down, didn't change my pace. Just kept running. My music was still playing, but I turned the volume down low so I could hear if he said or did anything. He didn't move as I passed, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. About 20 steps past him, I looked over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. He was still standing there, but now he had turned around. He was watching me. I told myself to focus. It was early, and maybe he was just out for a walk and curious about someone running by. I'd seen plenty of people in the park who seemed out of place. It didn't mean anything. But then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought it might just be someone else entering the park from another direction. I told myself not to panic, not to assume. But when I glanced back again, I saw him. He was walking now, heading in the same direction I was. Not running, not rushing. Just walking. He wasn't close, maybe 50 feet behind me, but he was there. I sped up a little, trying to create more distance between us. I told myself to stick to my route, not to change anything. If he was just walking, I'd be out of the park before he could get anywhere near me. I reached the end of the path and took the usual left turn toward the exit. When I glanced back again, he had turned too. My heart was pounding now, harder than it should have been from just running. I wasn't winded, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. I told myself to stay calm, to keep running, to act like nothing was wrong. But every time I looked back, he was still there. Always just far enough that it felt like I couldn't say anything or confront him, but close enough that I couldn't shake him. When I finally exited the park, I felt a small wave of relief. The street ahead was wider, brighter. A few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the early morning gloom. I thought about stopping, waiting for him to pass, but something told me that would be worse. I didn't want him to know I was scared. I kept running, heading toward the busier part of my route. There was a gas station about a quarter mile up. It was small, but the lights were always on, and there was usually someone inside. I decided I'd stop there if he was still following me. I didn't have to look back anymore, I could hear his footsteps now. They were steady, matching my pace. Not speeding up, not slowing down. Just following. When I reached the gas station, I didn't hesitate. I turned sharply and went straight inside. The man behind the counter looked up, surprised to see someone this early. I walked to the back, pretending to grab a bottle of water, but really just trying to catch my breath. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I stayed back there for a minute or two before glancing toward the door. He was standing outside. He wasn't looking in, just standing by the edge of the parking lot, like he was waiting for me to come out. His hands were in his pockets, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was listening for something. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the gas station forever, but I didn't want to leave while he was still there. The man behind the counter asked if I needed help, and I almost told him what was going on. But what could he do? Call the police because someone was walking behind me? After a few minutes, the man outside moved. He didn't leave, just shifted closer to the building, standing by the corner where I couldn't see him unless I walked out. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I walked to the counter and told the clerk there was a man outside who had been following me. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the fear in it. The clerk frowned, looking toward the door, then nodded. He told me to stay inside while he went to check. I watched as he stepped out, looking around. The man was gone. The clerk came back in and told me there was no one there, but I could tell he believed me. He asked if I needed him to call someone or if I wanted to wait for a ride. I nodded, pulling out my phone to call a friend. I didn't care that it was early. I just needed someone to pick me up. While I waited, I stayed near the counter, my eyes glued to the parking lot. My friend showed up about 10 minutes later, and I ran straight to their car, not looking back. I told them everything on the ride home, and they insisted on staying with me for the rest of the day. I didn't go running for a while after that. When I finally did, I chose a different route, one with more people and fewer places to hide. But even now, I can't shake the feeling of those footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate, like they were waiting for something. Like he was waiting for something. It was supposed to be a fun road trip. My wife, Rachel, and I had been planning this for months. We were taking the kids Olivia, who's 9, and Ethan, who's 12, on a week-long trip across the state. The plan was simple: drive through a few small towns, hit some parks, and just enjoy the time away. Everything was going smoothly until it wasn't. We were about 4 hours into the trip when Rachel, who was driving, suggested we take a scenic route off the highway. The GPS was showing a back road that cut through some woods and farmland. I thought it sounded nice. It'd give us a break from the monotonous highway and might make for some good photos. Besides, we had plenty of time. We took the turn and started down the narrow road. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. There were no other cars, no houses, just endless stretches of trees. As we drove on, I started to feel uneasy. There was something off about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees grew thick on either side of the road, and there was a stillness in the air, like the whole world was holding its breath. It didn't help that the sun was starting to set. The road twisted and turned, getting narrower the farther we went. My daughter Olivia started to complain that it was getting dark, and even Ethan seemed to be getting restless in the back seat. I figured it would just be a few more miles, so I told Rachel to keep going, but my gut told me something wasn't right. There was a nagging feeling that maybe we had gone too far. "Hey, Do you think we should turn back? I asked Rachel, trying to sound casual. I think we're fine, she said, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. We'll just check the map again. I'll find us a spot to turn around soon. That's when we saw it. A small town. It wasn't on the GPS, and I didn't remember passing any signs. But there it was, right at the end of the road. A place that looked like it belonged in the past. The buildings were old, rundown, some with broken windows and boarded up doors. The streetlights flickered as we drove through the empty main street. There wasn't a soul in sight. Rachel slowed the car to a crawl. I noticed an old gas station on the corner, the kind you see in movies, and a diner with its lights still on. But there was no one around. No cars. No people. Just the eerie quiet. This doesn't feel right, I said, more to myself than to Rachel. Maybe we should ask someone for directions, Rachel suggested. She sounded just as uncomfortable as I felt. We pulled into the gas station. The place was small, dusty, and the pumps looked ancient. I got out and walked over to the attendant, a middle-aged man who was sitting behind the counter, staring at a small TV. He didn't even look up as I approached. Hey, we're a little lost. We took a wrong turn, and we were wondering how to get back to the main road. The man slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. His face was expressionless, and his eyes were dull, almost lifeless. You shouldn't be here, he said flatly. I laughed nervously. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. You shouldn't be here, he repeated, his voice low, almost threatening. I glanced back at the car, where Rachel and the kids were waiting. We're just passing through, I said, trying to keep the situation light. Don't stay long, the man said. He finally stood up, walking slowly towards the back of the station without another word. I watched him disappear into the shadows of the building. I was starting to get a bad feeling about this place. Something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it wasn't right. I went back to the car quickly. Rachel, we need to go. Now. Rachel frowned. What happened? Just get us out of here, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. This place is off. We didn't drive more than a couple hundred yards before we saw the first person. A man, standing on the side of the road. He was tall, thin, and wearing an old, tattered jacket. His face was pale, with hollow cheeks, and he was staring directly at us as we passed. I didn't make eye contact, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us. That was weird, Rachel muttered under her breath. What do you think that guy was about? I don't know, but I don't want to find out, I said, looking back at the man in the rearview mirror. I think we should just turn around. We turned around, but by the time we reached the spot where we entered the town, there was another man standing in the road, blocking our path. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at us with a cold, calculating look. Rachel slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop a few feet from him. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at the car. Get out of the way. I shouted through the windshield, my pulse quickening. We need to leave. The man didn't move. My heart was pounding now. I didn't know what these people were doing here, but they weren't making any effort to help us. They were just watching us like we were prey. Rachel backed the car up, turning in the opposite direction, but before we could go far, another man appeared, this one much closer. He was leaning against a lamppost, casually smoking a cigarette. Do you have a problem? I yelled at him, my voice shaking. We don't want any trouble. We just need to leave. The man took a long drag of his cigarette and threw it on the ground. He slowly straightened up and took a step toward the car. You're not going anywhere, he said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a conversation. "Rachel, go! Now!" I shouted. Rachel hit the gas pedal, and we sped away, tires screeching as we turned down the narrow road. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the men following us. We didn't stop until we were back on the main highway, far away from that strange town. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing. The rest of the trip was quiet. Too quiet. We never talked about what happened. But we all knew. We were lucky to get out of there in one piece. And I swear, to this day, I can still see those faces in the rearview mirror, watching us as we drove away. I've been debating whether or not I should post this. It feels too weird to even talk about, but it's something that's been haunting me since it happened. I don't even know if I can make anyone understand just how strange and unsettling it was. But I have to get it off my chest. My boyfriend, Ben, and I were looking for a quiet weekend getaway. We've been dating for a little over a year, and we both needed a break from work. Something peaceful, somewhere remote, away from the noise of the city. We found this Airbnb listing in the middle of nowhere, an isolated cabin in a small rural town, with nothing around it but woods. Perfect for getting away from everything, or so we thought. The place looked charming in the photos, rustic and cozy, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and big windows. The host's profile was friendly enough, and the reviews were good, though there weren't many. The ones that were there seemed fine, nothing that stood out as unusual. So, we booked it. It was about a 4-hour drive, and we didn't mind the isolation. It felt like a perfect escape. We arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin sat by itself on a dirt road surrounded by dense trees, the kind of place you wouldn't want to be caught in after dark. But it looked charming, and the air smelled fresh. The first impression was good. The host, a man named Earl, greeted us. He was older, maybe in his mid-60s, with graying hair and a warm smile. He gave us a brief tour of the place, showing us the main living area, the kitchen, the bedroom, and a couple of other rooms. The cabin was small but nice, with just enough room for us to settle in and relax. Earl told us that if we needed anything, to just let him know, and that he'd leave us to enjoy the place. It was all very normal until he mentioned something about a crawl space. "Just be careful up there," he said, pointing to a small door in the ceiling of the hallway. "It's a little tight. I've kept it locked up for years. You don't need to worry about it." I didn't think much of it at the time. We were just looking forward to a quiet weekend, and the mention of a locked crawl space didn't seem all that strange. Earl left after showing us everything, and we were left to ourselves. That evening, we settled in. Ben and I had some drinks, cooked a simple dinner, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. It was nice. We went to bed early, both of us glad to have a break. But around 3 a.m., I woke up for no particular reason. I didn't hear anything, but I just couldn't fall back to sleep. I tossed and turned for a while, then decided to go to the bathroom. When I walked down the hallway toward the bathroom, I saw just a small, faint light coming from the edge of the crawlspace door. It was cracked open, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely. At first, I figured I had imagined it. Maybe I was just half asleep, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached it slowly, leaning in close. I could hear faint rustling, almost like something shifting inside. Maybe it was just an animal or the house settling. But it was enough to make me hesitate. I didn't want to wake Ben up, but my curiosity won out. I reached up to open the door and peered inside. The crawl space was small, barely tall enough to crouch in. It was dark, but the dim light from the hallway cast just enough glow for me to make out the edges of the space. There was a small, dusty box in the far corner. I couldn't resist. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, climbed up onto the ladder, and opened it. The box was filled with photographs, old ones. I could tell they were from different decades, ranging from the 90s to maybe the early 2000s. At first, I didn't think much of it. They were just regular pictures, people standing in front of the cabin, smiling. But then I looked closer at the backs of the photos. Each photo had notes written on it in small, neat handwriting. Stayed here July 15th, 2003, nice couple. December 12th, 1998, great guests, quiet. The more I flipped through, the worse it got. There were newer photos, two people I didn't recognize, but they were all taken at the cabin, smiling in front of the porch, or by the fireplace, or sitting on the couch. But as I went through them, something started to feel off. The notes began to change. The writing got darker. Stayed here November 3rd, 2011, he was nervous the whole time. June 6th, 2005, she kept looking out the window all night. And then, I found one that made my stomach drop. It was a picture of a woman, smiling like the others, but the note on the back was chilling. She never came back. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. There were several more like that. People who never came back or left early without explanation. I don't know why I kept reading, but I did. I heard a sound behind me. It was soft, but I could tell it wasn't just the owls settling. I turned around, feeling that panic rise in my chest. There, standing in the hallway, was Earl. His face was pale, almost sickly, and he was staring at me without saying a word. "Earl?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" He didn't respond at first. He just walked toward me slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence was deafening. "Those people," he finally said, his voice cold, "they didn't leave." "Not all of them." I didn't know what to say. I backed away from the crawl space, the box still in my hands. "What are you talking about?" Earl's face twisted in a way I'll never forget. He looked almost sad, like he was apologizing for something, but his eyes were calculating. "You weren't supposed to find that. You should have stayed away." I could barely breathe. I took another step back, but he was already standing too close. I didn't know what he was capable of. "You need to leave," he said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Now." I didn't wait for another second. I ran. I didn't even bother waking Ben. I grabbed my bag, slammed the front door open, and sprinted into the woods. I heard him calling after me, but I didn't stop. I never looked back. The next morning, I drove back home. Ben was confused when he woke up and saw I was gone, but I didn't tell him everything. I don't think he'd believe me if I did. But I can't shake what I found in that crawl space. The photos. The notes. Earl's face. The people who didn't leave. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I won't. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed another night. I don't ever want to find out. I decided to take a hike last weekend. I'd been stressed with work, and the idea of being out in the woods, away from everything, felt like exactly what I needed. I picked a trail in a remote area that wasn't too far from where I lived but wasn't overly popular. I didn't want crowds or noise. Just peace. The weather was perfect, cool and overcast, with a slight breeze. I parked my car at the small gravel lot by the trailhead and noticed only one other vehicle there, a beat-up truck with no plates on the front. That should have stood out more to me, but at the time, it didn't register as anything unusual. I chalked it up to a local hunter or someone who preferred the quiet like I did. The first mile or so was uneventful. The woods were dense, and the trail was narrow, but it was well marked. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. But then, just as the trail dipped into a small valley, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the mud. They were fresh, and they weren't mine. At first, I didn't think much of it. People hike all the time, and maybe whoever left them was ahead of me somewhere. Still, I couldn't help but look closer. The prints were deep, heavier than my own, and spaced in a way that suggested the person was walking at a steady, deliberate pace. I kept going, trying to brush it off. But as I moved, something started to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stopped a few times to listen, but the forest was quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. About 20 minutes later, the trail split into two paths. I decided to take the left one, mostly because it looked less traveled, and I wanted to avoid running into anyone. As I started down it, I glanced back at the footprints in the mud. They veered left too, right where I was going. That was when I started to get uneasy. There hadn't been anyone at the trailhead when I arrived except for that old truck, and I hadn't seen or heard another soul since starting. So who was out here, and why were their prints matching mine? I picked up my pace, trying to put some distance between myself and the thought of someone else being nearby. But every time I glanced back, I saw more footprints, fresh ones, heading in the same direction as me. It was as if whoever it was had sped up when I did. I stopped walking and turned around, scanning the trail behind me. Nothing. Just the trees and the path stretching back up the hill. I stood there for what felt like forever, straining to hear something, anything. But the woods stayed silent. I decided to change direction. I didn't want to head back to the car yet, but I figured cutting across the forest would shake whoever it was, if there even was someone. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the prints were just a coincidence. Still, I veered off the trail, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches to avoid leaving obvious tracks. The forest felt different once I was off the trail. The trees were closer together, their branches reaching down like they were trying to trap me. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and leaves, and it was harder to keep my bearings. But I pushed on, determined to lose whatever was making me uneasy. After about 10 minutes, I came to a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath. That's when I saw them again. Footprints. Right in the damp earth at the edge of the clearing. They were fresh, and they were mine, or almost mine. The spacing was too perfect, too deliberate, like someone had been following my exact path. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out here, and they were following me. My first thought was to call for help, but when I pulled out my phone, there was no signal. Of course. It was too remote for any reception. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was a hunter or another hiker, someone who'd taken an interest in my route but didn't mean any harm. But why stay hidden? Why not call out or pass me by? And how had they matched my steps so perfectly? I decided to keep moving. If I stayed still, I'd just give them more time to close in. I cut back toward the trail, keeping my movements quick but quiet. I didn't care about the footprints anymore. I just wanted to get back to my car. The trail felt longer than I remembered, and every step was filled with the nagging sense that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. Just trees, shadows, and the occasional flicker of movement that I couldn't quite place. Finally, I reached the last stretch of the trail. I could see the gravel lot through the trees, and my car was still there. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The truck was gone. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. The lot was empty except for my car. No sign of anyone else. No sign of the person who had been following me. I fumbled with my keys, glancing around the lot and the edge of the forest. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I checked my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me. But there was no one. The drive home felt endless. I kept looking at the road behind me, convinced I'd see headlights or a shadowy figure trailing me. But nothing happened. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the dark, trying to make sense of it all. I haven't gone back to that trail since. I probably never will. I can't stop thinking about the footprints, how they matched mine so perfectly, and how I never once saw the person who left them. Whoever they were, they knew how to stay hidden. And they wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I don't know why I didn't think twice about it. Maybe it was the fact that I was just trying to get rid of an old camera I didn't use anymore. Or maybe it was the excitement of making a little extra cash. Either way, I ended up agreeing to meet the buyer in a parking lot late one afternoon to finalize the sale. Looking back, it was stupid. I'd listed the camera on one of those buy-sell groups online. It wasn't anything fancy, just an older model, but I figured someone would want it for a good price. The buyer seemed interested right away. His name was Jake. He messaged me asking if the camera was still available, and after a few quick back-and-forth messages, we agreed to meet up. I gave him the address of a small parking lot near a strip mall. It wasn't too busy, but it was public enough that I thought nothing of it. The day of the meeting came, and I had the camera packed up, ready to go. I got in my car and drove to the lot. As I pulled in, I saw a car already parked near the corner. It wasn't the one Jake had told me he'd be in, but I figured he had arrived early or parked elsewhere. I parked a few spaces away, keeping the camera bag with me. I sent him a quick message to let him know I had arrived, and he replied almost immediately, saying he was on his way and would be there in a minute. I was feeling good, thinking this was all going smoothly. Maybe a little too smooth. I saw a guy approaching my car, and I figured that was Jake. He was tall, wearing a hoodie, and he had a nervous energy about him. He walked up to my passenger side window and knocked on it. I rolled it down. "Hey, you Jake?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, man," he replied. "You got the camera?" I nodded, holding it up. "All set. Just like we talked about." He grinned, but there was something off about it. Cool. Mind if I check it out first? I've got to make sure it works." I handed it to him, still feeling confident that this was all above board. But then, just as he took the camera, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. 2 more guys had walked up to the car, one on each side. They were standing close, like they were trying to block me in. I froze for a second, my heart starting to race. I felt the air change, thick with tension. It was like something clicked in my head, and all of a sudden, everything didn't feel right anymore. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice trembling a little more than I intended. Jake didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at the camera, turning it over in his hands. The two others didn't say anything either. They just stood there, arms crossed, staring at me. That's when I realized they were all way too calm for a normal transaction. Then Jake looked up from the camera, and I saw it, the shift in his expression. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something darker. His eyes flicked over to the guy standing by my driver's side, and the other guy on the passenger side tensed up. Without warning, the guy on my side reached for the door handle and pulled it open. "Get out," he ordered. His voice was low, hard, like he had done this 1,000 times before. I didn't move. My brain was trying to process what was happening, but it was all too fast. They couldn't be serious, could they? But the way they were acting, the way they were closing in, told me everything I needed to know. They weren't here to buy anything. They were here to take it. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out something metallic. My brain didn't immediately register it, but it was a gun. He pointed it at me, the barrel trembling slightly, but the intent behind it was clear. "You're not getting out of this car," he said, his voice flat. "You're gonna give us everything." My pulse was pounding in my ears. My mind was racing, trying to think of something, anything to do. But I was stuck. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight them off. I was trapped, alone in a parking lot, with 3 guys who were clearly ready to hurt me if I didn't comply. The guy on the passenger side grabbed the camera bag from the seat next to me, tugging it hard until it came free. "What else you got?" he demanded, shoving the bag in my face. I could hear my breath catch in my chest. "I don't have anything else." "That's it, just the camera." Jake scoffed, not believing me. He leaned in closer, his breath hot on my face. "I'm not asking again. You got cash? Your phone? Anything else you're hiding?" I could feel my hands start to shake, but I didn't want to give them anything. I didn't want to lose everything I had on me, but I knew better than to fight back. These guys weren't playing. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't here for a deal. They were here to rob me, and they were getting desperate. The guy on the passenger side grabbed my phone from the seat next to me without even asking, tossing it into the back seat with the rest of my stuff. I was too stunned to do anything. My stomach felt like it was turning over in knots. Jake's hand tightened on the gun. "Everything," he said again, more insistently this time. "Give us the keys. You're gonna get out of the car." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't have any keys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That was a lie. I still had the car keys in my pocket, but I wasn't about to hand them over. I couldn't. If I did, I was as good as gone. Jake's eyes flicked to my pocket, and I saw the shift in his expression. The realization that I wasn't giving him everything he wanted. Without warning, he shoved the gun into my face, pressing the cold barrel against my cheek. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said through gritted teeth. My chest was tight, my hands sweating. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get out of this. I was paralyzed with fear, but my mind was also working overtime. I could hear the sound of cars passing by in the distance, but the parking lot was empty. No one was around. I felt the car doors unlock. The guy on the passenger side had opened the door, and they were getting ready to drag me out. I had no time to waste. There was only one thing I could think of doing. I grabbed the steering wheel, yanked it hard, and slammed the car into reverse. The impact knocked the guy standing behind me off balance, and I heard him shout as I hit the gas. The car jerked back, scraping the side of the car next to me. In the chaos, Jake fired a shot, but I didn't stop. I floored it, tearing out of the parking lot and speeding down the street without a second thought. I didn't care where I was going, I just had to get away. I didn't stop until I saw a well-lit gas station. I pulled into the lot and jumped out of the car, running toward the door, my heart still racing. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't see them chasing me. I didn't even hear the sound of their car, but I wasn't taking any chances. I ran inside, told the cashier what had happened, and called the police. When they arrived, they took my statement, and I gave them everything I could remember about the guys, what they looked like, what their car looked like. But nothing came of it. They couldn't find them. No arrests were made. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. I don't know if they were just after the camera or if they had other plans. But I can tell you one thing, I'm never making that mistake again. It only takes one moment of trust to change everything. And when I let my guard down, everything almost came crashing down with it. It started out like a regular stop. I was driving back from a long road trip, somewhere between exhausted and delirious from being in the car for hours. I pulled into a gas station just off the highway, hoping to stretch my legs and grab a drink. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was one of those typical, half-lit, low-key places where you'd stop just to fuel up and keep moving. The pumps were almost empty, with only a couple of other cars scattered around the lot. I parked near the front, ready to top off my tank and grab some snacks. The weather was a little overcast, the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel just a bit off. As I walked toward the door of the station, I noticed a man standing near one of the pumps. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a faded red jacket, a cap pulled low over his eyes, and jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. He gave me a friendly nod when he saw me, and I instinctively nodded back, though I wasn't really in the mood to chat. I'd been on the road for far too long and just wanted to get back home. But then he said something that made me stop in my tracks. "Hey, man, you look like you could use a wash." I stopped, frowning a little. Was he talking to me? I glanced at my car. It wasn't particularly dirty, but the long trip had left it a little dusty. Not enough to make me want to get a full wash, but enough to make me wonder if maybe it wouldn't hurt. "You sure you don't want a free wash while you're here?" he added. "Ah, free?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yep, free. Just trying to help out people like you on the road. Free wash, no strings attached." Something about it felt a little off, but at the same time, I figured it couldn't hurt. I had some time to kill, and if it was truly free, what was the worst that could happen? "All right," I said, pulling my keys out of my pocket. "Why not?" He gave me a smile that seemed almost too wide, like he was trying a bit too hard to seem friendly. Still, I didn't think much of it. I handed him my keys and started walking toward the convenience store to grab a drink. As I walked in, I could still see the man in my car, opening the door and starting to spray something on the windows. I didn't think it was weird at the time, but I should have been more cautious. It only took a minute before the unease started to creep in. I went straight to the cooler, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked up to the counter. The cashier gave me a look that I could only describe as uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just late and he was tired. But when I paid and turned around to head back outside, something felt wrong. The man with my car was gone. I froze, a chill running down my spine. My car was still there, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I glanced over at the other vehicles parked around the lot, but no one was paying attention. The gas station was still mostly empty. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe he was just washing my car in a different part of the lot. But my gut told me otherwise. I could feel my heart rate picking up. Something wasn't right. I started walking towards the exit, scanning the area for any sign of him. And then I saw it. The car. My car. It was moving. I saw it just as it sped out of the lot, tires screeching as it turned onto the highway. I froze. My legs felt like they were made of lead as the realization hit me. The man had stolen my car. I stood there, staring after it for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It was like a bad dream, something that didn't feel real. I'd been gone for just a few minutes. How could he have taken my car that quickly? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to chase after him, but my legs wouldn't move. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called the police. "They stole my car," I said, my voice trembling. "A man just took my car." I was only inside for a minute. I could hear the dispatcher trying to calm me down, asking for my location and the details of the car. But all I could think about was how quickly it had happened. How had he done it? Was he just waiting for someone to leave their car unattended? Did he know exactly what he was doing? I walked back to the pump, staring at the empty spot where my car had been parked. The whole scene felt surreal. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. They asked me to explain what had happened. I told them everything I could remember, but it didn't seem like much. I'd been inside for maybe 5 minutes, tops. When I came out, the car was gone. One officer asked if there was anything valuable in the car, but I couldn't think of anything in the moment. It wasn't like I had a lot of personal things in there, but I realized I didn't even know what the man had been able to take before he drove off. They asked me to wait while they filed the report. I didn't want to stick around any longer, so I left the station and went back to my hotel, my mind racing the entire time. How had he been able to take my car so easily? Was it a setup? Was it the kind of thing he did every night, preying on tired, unsuspecting drivers? The next day, the police called me to say they found the car abandoned at the side of the road. The thief had left it there, empty. I didn't get the car back until a few days later, after they finished collecting evidence. By then, I'd already canceled my insurance and filed a report with the DMV, assuming the worst. I still think about it sometimes. How easy it was for him to approach me, how quickly he had my car in his possession, and how no one at the gas station seemed to have seen anything. I never did find out who that man was or what he really wanted. Maybe it was just a one-off, maybe it wasn't. But now, every time I stop at a gas station, I'm more cautious. I never let anyone touch my keys unless I'm absolutely sure who they are. I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. I wasn't sure what I was expecting when I checked into the hotel. It was a last-minute booking after a long day of travel, and honestly, I was just looking forward to getting some sleep. I'd been on the road for nearly 12 hours and my body was aching. So when I arrived at the hotel, I didn't really pay much attention to the details. I grabbed my room key and made my way up to the 3rd floor, expecting to just crash and forget about the world for a few hours. The room was pretty standard for a mid-range hotel, nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. A bed, a small desk, a TV that I wasn't going to use, and a bathroom that was far too small for my liking. But at that point, I didn't care. I was just glad to have a roof over my head for the night. I locked the door behind me, unpacked a few things, and threw myself on the bed. The hotel was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest, but I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I figured most of the other guests were already asleep. I set my alarm for an early start the next day, and I pulled the covers up, sinking into the warmth of the bed. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I was exhausted, and the comfort of the hotel bed quickly lulled me into a deep, dreamless slumber. The first thing that woke me up was the sound of my door unlocking. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. But then, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock, followed by a soft click. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't ordered room service, and I hadn't told anyone I was in town, so why would someone be unlocking my door at this hour? I listened, straining to hear any sounds, but everything was eerily quiet. I told myself it was probably just the hotel staff. Maybe they were checking something, doing a routine check, or maybe it was a mistake. They could have been given the wrong room key by mistake. But that didn't explain why the door opened. I was too scared to move, but my curiosity pushed me to inch closer to the door. I could hear soft footsteps, almost hesitant. The door cracked open just a little more, and I could see the shadow of someone standing in the hallway. Then the door opened all the way. A man stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. He looked disoriented, like he'd just woken up himself. He was holding a room key, and he looked down at it, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I think there's been a mistake. I was given this room key at the front desk. I'm supposed to be in here." I sat up in bed, blinking in disbelief. "What?" The man took a step into the room. His clothes were disheveled, as though he'd been traveling or just got out of bed. His hair was messy, and he had that look on his face, the one people get when they don't quite know what's going on. I could see him glancing around the room, clearly confused. "I'm really sorry," he repeated. "They must have given me the wrong key." I stared at him, still trying to process what was happening. My first instinct was to get up, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something about the way he stood there, looking like he didn't belong, made me feel like I was the one who didn't belong in the room. I should have said something, called the front desk, but the words didn't come out. "You're sure you're in the right room?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he'd gotten confused. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he just made a mistake. But even as I asked, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. "I don't know," he said, fidgeting with the key in his hand. He looked over at me again, his face a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "They told me this was where I was supposed to be." There was an odd hesitation in his voice, something off. And yet, there was this genuine, almost apologetic tone in the way he spoke. Something felt wrong. I quickly glanced at the door, then back at the man. It all felt surreal. Why would he walk into a room at this hour, acting so casual about it? Why didn't he immediately apologize and leave when he realized his mistake? "Okay, I think you need to go back downstairs," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I'm not sure what happened, but... Before I could finish, the man stepped further into the room, his presence blocking the doorway. He didn't push past me, but he didn't move either. He stood there, still holding the key, staring at me as if he was processing something. The more I looked at him, the more I realized how out of place he seemed. I tried to stand up, but something stopped me. The room felt smaller now, almost like the walls were closing in. There was this feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that kept growing. My hand reached for my phone on the bedside table, but I was too slow. I'm really sorry, the man said again, his eyes never leaving mine. I didn't mean to intrude. But this is my room, right? I swallowed hard. My heart was racing, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat. Something about the way he asked that question, it was like he didn't even care whether he was supposed to be there or not. I finally found my voice. No, it's not. I've been here all night. I'm the one staying here. I reached for my phone again, this time with more urgency. But the man took a step forward, and I froze. No, it's fine, he said quickly, his tone suddenly shifting. There was a forced calmness to his voice now, almost too calm. It's just a mistake. I'll go down and get it sorted out. I'm really sorry. But he didn't move. For a few seconds, we just stood there, eye to eye, in that silent space between us. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't make sense of what was happening. It didn't feel like an accident anymore. It felt deliberate. All right, I said, slowly, my voice shaky. I'm calling the front desk now. I held my phone up, but the man suddenly snapped out of his daze and backed away from me. His expression shifted again, his eyes darting around the room as if realizing how far he'd crossed the line. Yeah, of course, he mumbled, his voice quiet, almost as if he wasn't sure of himself anymore. I'll go get this fixed. And just like that, he turned, walking out of the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. I waited a few moments, my heart still racing, before I picked up the phone and dialed the front desk. The person on the other end answered quickly, sounding cheerful. Front desk, how can I help you? Yeah, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, there's been a mistake. Someone just walked into my room with a key. They said it was the same key I was given, but there's no way that's possible. Can you double-check the room assignments for me? There was a brief pause. Of course, the clerk replied, her voice suddenly more businesslike. Give me one moment. She came back to the phone, her tone much more serious now. I'm sorry, but according to our system, there's no record of anyone being assigned that room key tonight. Are you sure the person you spoke to was from the hotel? I didn't have the words to explain what I was feeling. The man had seemed so convincing, so sure of himself. But now, after hearing that, the whole situation felt even stranger. Why had he been so confident that he belonged there? Why didn't he leave when I asked him to? I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been awake. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been alert enough to hear the door unlock. But I do know one thing now, I'll never look at hotels the same way again. Every time I close my hotel room door, I wonder who else might be on the other side. It started like a regular Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished work, was feeling tired, and was getting ready to settle in for the evening. My phone rang at about 6 p.m., a number I didn't recognize. I thought it was probably a spam call, but I answered anyway. Hello? I said, not expecting much. The voice on the other end was shaky, panicked. Is this Jeff? It's Mark, your cousin. I've been in a car accident. I'm hurt bad, and I really need your help. I froze for a second. Mark was my cousin, but we hadn't talked in a while. The last time I saw him was at a family reunion a few years ago. He seemed to be in a lot of pain. His voice was hard to recognize, and the urgency in his words caught me off guard. Mark, what happened? Are you okay? I asked, already reaching for my wallet just in case. I don't know. I was driving, and some guy ran a red light. I don't have much time to explain. I'm at the hospital now, but I need money for the medical bills. I can't get out of here without it. Please, Jeff, I don't know what to do. They're saying I need to pay up front or they won't treat me. Please, I'm scared, man. I could hear him breathing heavily, and for a moment, it almost sounded like he was crying. I'd never heard him like this before, and I started to panic. Okay, just tell me where to send the money. I'll help you. Don't tell anyone, he added quickly. I don't want anyone to know I'm in this mess. Just you. I trust you. His voice was full of desperation, and I couldn't think straight. I asked for his details, and he gave me the account number to transfer the money to. He said he'd explain everything when we could talk in person, but that he needed the money immediately or things would get worse. I didn't even hesitate. I sent the money. I just wanted to help, and I assumed it was a genuine emergency. I didn't think about how odd it was that I hadn't heard from him in so long, or that I'd never gotten a call from a hospital asking for money up front. I didn't think about anything other than getting him the help he said he needed. Once I transferred the money, I sat back, relieved. He promised he would call me again after he got out of the hospital, but he never did. In fact, I didn't hear from him at all that night. I assumed he was just dealing with the accident and the aftermath. The next morning, I woke up to a missed call from the same number. I checked my phone, and there was a voicemail from the same voice. Jeff, it's Mark. They're saying I need more money. The bills are piling up, and I don't know what to do. Please help me out. I can't get out of here without it. I was confused. More money? I thought. He didn't say anything about more money the night before. But at this point, I was already too far in. I called him back. He picked up immediately, but this time, his voice was different. It wasn't the same frantic, scared tone from last night. It was colder, almost robotic. Hey, Jeff, he said, like nothing had happened. I need more. The doctors won't let me go without paying, and they're threatening to involve the police if I don't get them the money. Wait, hold on, I interrupted. What's going on? You said you needed money last night. Why are you asking for more? There was a brief pause on the line before he spoke again, his voice still calm but with a hint of tension in it. I'm not sure what's happening, but they're saying they can't treat me unless I pay up. I don't know what else to do. Please, I'm stuck here. I hesitated. Something felt wrong. The change in his voice from last night to now, the way he seemed to be more focused on money than his condition, it didn't sit right with me. I decided to look into it. Mark, can you tell me the name of the hospital you're at? Maybe I can call them and confirm things, I said, trying to stay calm. There was another pause. Longer this time. No. I don't want you to call. Please, just send the money. I can't explain it all right now. Mark, this doesn't make sense. I'm calling the hospital, I said firmly. There was a long, tense silence before he spoke again. His voice sounded cold, almost threatening. You better not, he said, in a voice that wasn't at all like his. If you don't send the money, I'll make sure things get a lot worse for you. You don't want to mess with me, Jeff. I felt the blood drain from my face. The tone in his voice was completely different from the voice of my cousin. This wasn't Mark. It couldn't be. My mind raced as I started to realize what was happening. I hung up the phone and immediately tried to contact Mark's parents. I called his mother, but she didn't pick up. I left a voicemail asking if she'd heard from him, if he was really in the hospital. Then, I started Googling the hospital that Mark had mentioned. Nothing matched. I called the hospital directly, and they told me they had no records of him being admitted. I felt sick to my stomach. I went through everything again, trying to find any clue I had missed. I went back to the phone number. I Googled it. It was a prepaid phone, not linked to anyone I knew. That's when I realized I'd been scammed. But it didn't end there. For the next week, I kept getting calls from the same number. I blocked it, but the calls kept coming from different numbers. Sometimes it was the same voice, but sometimes it sounded like a different person altogether. They told me they knew where I lived. They told me they knew I was home when I wasn't. They threatened to hurt me, to hurt my family, if I didn't send more money. I had to get the police involved at that point. They told me it was a known scam, a common one where criminals pose as relatives in need of emergency funds. But the calls kept coming, even after I had reported it. They got more threatening, more aggressive. I changed my phone number, moved apartments, and took as many precautions as I could. But the feeling of being watched, of having someone track me, never really left. Even though I've been free from the calls for a while now, I still check my locks at night, still wonder if I'm being watched. I never thought something like this could happen to me. I thought I was careful. But this was different. It felt real. And for a while, it was my nightmare. I'll start by saying I don't know why I didn't leave earlier. I should have. Something about the whole night felt off, and I should have listened to that gut feeling. It all started when my friend Alex invited me to a party at his place. He was having a bunch of people over, and I didn't really know most of them, but I figured it would be a decent way to spend my Saturday night. I hadn't seen Alex in a while, and he always throws pretty chill get-togethers, so I was looking forward to it. When I arrived, the house was packed. People were laughing, music was playing, and everyone seemed to be in their own groups. I didn't recognize many faces, but it wasn't a big deal. I didn't mind hanging out by myself for a bit. I grabbed a drink and started chatting with some people I kind of knew, but it didn't take long for me to notice this one guy standing off to the side. At first, I thought maybe he was just shy or maybe he didn't know anyone, but as the night went on, it became clear that he wasn't just quietly observing like I initially thought. He wasn't talking to anyone, not even making eye contact. Just standing there, kind of blending into the background, but in a way that made you notice him. It was like he was trying to be invisible, but not in the way you'd expect someone to blend in. He was off. I found myself glancing over at him a few times, not sure what to make of it. I'd seen people like him at parties before, the ones who don't seem to fit in, who just kind of stand there, not knowing how to engage. But he wasn't even looking at anyone. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or doing anything normal. Just standing still, watching. I figured he was just weird, maybe a little socially awkward. But it made me uncomfortable after a while. So, I decided to get away from the crowd for a bit and went to use the bathroom. The bathroom in Alex's house was down the hall, past the kitchen, away from where most people were hanging out. I didn't think much of it when I walked in and started washing my hands. But as soon as I heard the bathroom door creak open, I froze. It was the guy from earlier. He didn't knock or say anything, just walked in like it was normal. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I should say something or just ignore it. He didn't seem like the type who would be in a hurry, so I figured he was just waiting for me to finish. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stood in the doorway, looking at me. Not with curiosity, but like he was waiting for something. I felt this strange chill run through me. Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. I was hoping he'd just say something and leave. But instead, he stepped forward and closed the door behind him. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mind was racing. I didn't know this guy, and it wasn't normal for people to just lock the door behind themselves in someone else's house. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice shaky. I was trying not to sound scared, but I could feel my heart pounding. The guy didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if he was serious or if he was just strange. He didn't seem dangerous at first, but the way he was standing there, like it was all a game to him, made me nervous. "I was just wondering," he began, his voice soft but persistent. "How long have you known Alex?" I blinked. "I don't know, a few years. We met in college." He nodded, but then he took another step toward me. I took a step back without thinking. I didn't know what he wanted, but I didn't want to be alone in a locked bathroom with him. "Do you live around here?" he asked, his voice becoming more focused. It was like he was studying me. The questions were so random, so out of place. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to figure out if I could make a run for it or if I should say something to get him to leave. But he wasn't letting up. He kept asking more and more personal questions. "Do you like this neighborhood? Do you walk your dog here? Do you live alone? What do you do for work?" The questions kept coming, one after another, each one stranger than the last. I could feel my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I could feel myself getting more and more uncomfortable. This was way beyond casual conversation. "Look, I don't know you," I finally said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I think you need to leave." I moved toward the door, but he didn't step aside. "No," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "I just need to understand. It's important." My hands were shaking, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just stand there and let this happen. I took a deep breath and pushed past him, slamming my shoulder into his chest as I opened the door. "Hey," he shouted, but I didn't stop. I ran down the hall and straight out the front door, not even bothering to look back. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't dare slow down. When I got outside, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. I don't know why, but something told me if I hadn't gotten out of there when I did, I might have ended up in a situation I didn't want to be in. My heart was still racing, and I could feel my legs shaking. I didn't even care about the party anymore. I texted Alex and told him I had to leave. He tried to convince me to stay, but I wasn't having it. I couldn't stop thinking about that guy, about his cold stare, about the way he wouldn't let me go. I haven't been back to Alex's house since. And every time I think about that guy, I feel sick to my stomach. I don't know what his deal was, or why he was asking me all those questions, but I have a feeling I don't want to know. All I know is I'm never going to a party there again. I've been walking my dog every evening for years now, same route, same time. It's part of my routine, and honestly, it's something I look forward to. My dog, Charlie, is a golden retriever, so he loves it too. There's a park nearby, and I usually just go around the block and let him sniff around. It's never been anything special, just a quiet walk. A few weeks ago, though, something happened that's made me rethink even stepping outside after dark. It started on a Tuesday evening. The sky was getting that deep, dusky color, and I had Charlie on his leash as usual. We were just about to turn onto the main road when I noticed a woman walking toward me on the opposite side of the street. She had a small dog, a little terrier, which was trotting along beside her. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another person out with their pet. As we got closer, she smiled and waved, and I returned it out of politeness. She then said, "Your dog is really cute. What's his name?" "Charlie," I said, holding up the leash slightly so she could see the dog's face more clearly. "Nice to meet you, Charlie," she said in this friendly, high-pitched voice. Then she took a step closer, and her dog gave a little bark in Charlie's direction, which made Charlie wag his tail and do that little dog thing where they both try to figure each other out. "Where do you live?" she asked casually, and I remember it catching me off guard a bit. I don't usually share that kind of detail with people I meet on walks, but it wasn't like she was asking for my address, just something vague, so I didn't think much of it. "Just a few blocks down that way," I said, pointing down the street, trying to keep the conversation light. I figured she was just being friendly. "How about you?" "Oh, I live just around the corner," she said, waving vaguely in the direction of a different street. "I don't think I've seen you around before. How long have you been in the neighborhood?" I told her I'd been living here for a couple of years. She nodded like she was processing that, then her eyes seemed to drift over my house for a second, but I didn't think much of it at the time. She asked a few more questions about my house, if I liked the neighborhood, if I had lived here long, what brought me to the area. I answered as best as I could without getting into anything too personal. It all seemed innocent enough, though I did feel a little weird with how much she wanted to know about my routine. After a few more minutes of small talk, she said, "Well, it was nice talking to you and Charlie. Maybe I'll see you again." I nodded and waved her off, and she turned and went down the side street, her dog trotting behind her. At the time, I thought it was just a friendly conversation. But over the next couple of days, things started to feel off. The following evening, I took Charlie out for our usual walk, but I noticed something strange. As I walked down the road, I caught a glimpse of her across the street, standing in the shadows of a tree. I wasn't sure if it was her at first, but when she stepped into the light, I could see her clearly. She was watching me. Just standing there, staring. I didn't think much of it at first. People go for walks, sometimes they just stand and look at things, right? But then I saw her again the next day, in the same spot, looking right at me as I walked by. I could have sworn she was waiting for me to pass by. By the third day, I started feeling uneasy. She wasn't just standing there anymore. This time, she was sitting on a bench, holding her dog in her lap, staring directly at me as I walked Charlie. I waved, but she didn't wave back. She didn't even acknowledge me. I started to feel that creeping discomfort, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just waiting for someone or passing the time. But then, it happened again. The next evening, she was there once more, standing at the corner of the street, watching me. It was like she was always there, at the same time, at the same spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching my every move. I started to hurry past, trying not to look at her. But one evening, when I was almost home, I glanced over and saw her standing across the street, staring at me again. I could feel my pulse quicken, my mind starting to race. I turned to look at Charlie. He was still his usual self, but I could tell something wasn't right. His ears were perked up, his tail wasn't wagging, and he kept glancing back at me like he knew something was wrong too. I decided to turn down another street, taking a longer route home, hoping I wouldn't see her anymore, But as I looked back, I saw her standing in the distance, right where I would have walked past. She wasn't just standing anymore, she was walking slowly toward me, her eyes locked on mine. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for the first time in a long while, I felt afraid. I could hear the sound of my footsteps on the pavement, the distant hum of cars passing, but everything felt so still. I picked up my pace, turning corners quickly, trying to distance myself from her. But I could feel her eyes on my back, following me. I didn't look back again after that. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I finally reached my apartment. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and drew the curtains. I didn't go outside for the rest of the night. It's been a few days since that happened. I've been keeping an eye out for her, but I haven't seen her again. I don't know if I'm just paranoid or if something's wrong, but I can't shake the feeling that she's been watching me for longer than I realized. I've tried telling a few people about it, but they don't seem to think it's a big deal. Maybe it's nothing, but I don't know. I can't forget those eyes staring at me, following me, like she was waiting for something. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe walking down that street again. It started small, just a couple of times. I didn't think much of it at first, honestly. When I moved into this neighborhood, I knew I would eventually meet the people around me. It was a quiet street, a mix of young families, retirees, and single professionals. Everyone mostly kept to themselves, which was fine by me. I liked my privacy, and I wasn't interested in becoming too close with anyone. But then I met Margaret, my neighbor from next door. At first, it seemed innocent enough. One evening, I was walking up the stairs to my front door when I saw her standing by her own door. She was a little older than me, in her early 50s, but friendly enough. She waved and came over to chat, something about how she'd noticed me moving in a few weeks ago. We made small talk. She told me she'd lived in the house for over a decade, and I gave her the standard response about being new to the area and trying to settle in. It wasn't long before she asked if I had a can of vegetable oil she could borrow. She said she was in the middle of cooking dinner, and she'd run out. I didn't think twice before I handed it over. "Of course, no problem," I said, handing her the can with a smile. She thanked me and promised to return it the next day. I didn't think anything more about it. That's just the kind of neighborly thing to do, right? The next day, at around 11 p.m., I heard a knock on my door. It was Margaret, holding the can of vegetable oil. "I'm so sorry, it got late," she said with a nervous laugh. "I just wanted to make sure you had it back before the night was over." I wasn't bothered by it. It was late, but she seemed like the type of person who wanted to make things right. "No problem," I said, smiling. "Thanks for bringing it back." Over the next few weeks, things continued like this. It was always something small, a cup of sugar, a set of measuring spoons, a screwdriver. She'd ask if she could borrow them, and most of the time, I'd say yes, thinking she was just being friendly. But then, without fail, she would show up at my door late at night, usually after 10 p.m., to return whatever she'd borrowed. It wasn't just the timing that started to bug me, though. It was the way she behaved when she came over. The first couple of times, it seemed normal enough. She'd knock, I'd answer, she'd give me whatever I had lent her, and we'd exchange pleasantries. But after a while, I noticed a pattern. She started lingering at the door longer than necessary. Just standing there, talking about random things. She'd mention something about her day, ask how my job was going, or bring up the weather in a way that felt almost rehearsed. It was always the same things. and it started to make me uncomfortable. Then came the night when it crossed a line. It was a Thursday, I remember. I had just gotten home from work and was preparing a quick dinner when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I opened it, I was surprised to see Margaret standing there. "Hey," she said with a soft smile. "I know it's late, but I just realized I've run out of tape. Could I borrow some? I'll return it tomorrow, I promise." I sighed, but it wasn't a big deal. I grabbed the tape from the drawer and handed it to her. "No problem," I said, trying to keep the conversation brief. "I've got to finish making dinner." But she didn't leave. She just stood there, almost as if waiting for me to invite her in. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, a little awkwardly. Well, I hope that helps." Instead of heading back to her own door like I expected, she stepped closer. "Actually," she said, her voice low, "do you mind if I come in for a second? I just need to use your bathroom real quick. I've been out all day, and I really need to go." Now, this was unusual. I had only known her for a few weeks, and while we'd exchanged pleasantries, I didn't feel comfortable with her coming inside. "Oh, I'm actually in the middle of something," I said, hoping she would get the hint. "Maybe next time?" She smiled, but it wasn't the same warm smile as before. It felt forced, like she was trying too hard to appear casual. "No worries. I'll just be quick," she said, before stepping over the threshold before I could stop her. I didn't know how to react. Part of me was saying this was a little too much, inviting herself in like that. But part of me didn't want to make a scene, so I just let it happen. I followed her inside, feeling this uncomfortable tension building in my chest. Margaret went straight to the bathroom without saying much, and I stood in the living room, trying to distract myself. A few moments later, she came out, not having said a word, and returned to the door. "Thanks again," she said, her tone a little too casual. "I really appreciate it." I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Something about her sudden invasion of my space felt off, but I was too tired and too uneasy to say anything. She left quietly, but that night, I didn't sleep well. The next few days were more of the same. Small things, small requests, and always returning them later than expected. Each time, she seemed to linger a little longer. The conversations felt forced, the air always thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her visits had become a regular part of my life now, and it was starting to get exhausting. I started avoiding answering the door when I knew she was going to come by. I pretended not to be home, even when I heard her knock. But it wasn't until one night that I realized just how far things had gone. I had just gotten home from a late shift and was exhausted. I barely had the energy to make a cup of tea when there was a knock at the door. I knew it was Margaret, and for once, I was too tired to be polite. I just let the silence stretch on, hoping she'd go away. But then I heard it, just the softest scratch against the door. It was so quiet I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. Then it came again. A small tap, followed by the sound of something sliding across the bottom of the door. I bent down to look. There, just below the crack of the door, was a small envelope with my name written on it in black ink. I opened it carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a note. "I think I've overstayed my welcome," it said. "I'll be back tonight. Don't worry, I'll leave soon enough." I didn't know what to do. I had never felt so trapped in my own home before. It had been happening for so long that I hadn't even realized how much it had affected me until now. I had never asked Margaret to leave me alone, but I couldn't help but wonder if I had been too passive about it. If I had somehow allowed her to push past my boundaries, even when I didn't want her to. I still haven't figured out what to do about it. I've been locking the door earlier, avoiding her as best I can, but the tension is still there. Margaret still comes by every few days, and I've started noticing strange things, items out of place, things that I didn't borrow or use, and the feeling that someone has been in my house when I wasn't around. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that everything is normal. I don't know what will happen if I tell her to stay away. But I know one thing, I need to do something. Because the longer I wait, the harder it's going to be to make her leave. It started like any other renovation project. I had just bought my first home, a little place on the edge of town, and it needed a lot of work. The floors were creaky, the walls were covered in old wallpaper, and the kitchen was stuck in the 90s. But I loved the potential it had, and I was excited to start turning it into something that felt like mine. I hired a local contractor that came highly recommended. The company had decent reviews, and I figured it would be a good fit. They gave me an estimate, went over the work, and within a week, I had a crew come in to start the renovations. For the most part, everything went smoothly. The workers were polite, they showed up on time, and they did what they were supposed to do. It was messy, of course, but that's to be expected with any renovation. I was living in the house while the work was going on, and most of the workers didn't bother me too much, apart from the occasional noise or them asking where to put something. They'd work until late afternoon, and then they'd leave. But then there was Jeff. Jeff was one of the contractors who seemed to take a little longer with his work. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a big house, and I assumed he was just being thorough. He was probably in his mid-30s, average height, dark hair, and a bit of a rough look to him, but he wasn't rude. He just lingered. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I would leave the house to run errands or go to work, and Jeff would still be there, working. He'd tell me, just want to finish up for the day, or I'm almost done with this part, and then I'll be out of your way. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, but after a while, it started to feel odd. I never saw the others stick around as long as he did, and honestly, I started to get a little uncomfortable. The first red flag came about 2 weeks into the renovation. I came back early from the store, and I was shocked to find Jeff still in the house, long after everyone else had left. The other contractors were gone for the day, and the house was quiet. I walked in through the back door, and there he was, standing in the kitchen with his back to me. He was alone, surrounded by piles of tools and some debris from where they'd ripped out the cabinets. "Hey, Jeff. You still here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned around and gave me a sheepish smile. "Yeah, just wanted to finish the trim in the kitchen. Thought I could knock it out while everyone was gone." I nodded, but something in the way he said it didn't sit right with me. "Okay, well, be careful with those nails," I said, trying to keep it light. "You don't want to hit a pipe or something." "Don't worry," he said, a little too quickly. "I know what I'm doing. Just need a few more minutes." He didn't leave until about an hour later. I was already getting dinner ready by then, and I figured it was just part of the process. But then, over the next few days, the same thing kept happening. I'd come home, and Jeff would be there, working alone. Sometimes, I'd see him when I got home from errands. Other times, I'd hear him moving around in the house, long after the others had left. One evening, I came back from work later than usual, and when I walked through the front door, I saw that the lights were on in the living room, even though I'd been expecting the house to be empty. At first, I thought maybe I'd left a light on by mistake, but then I saw Jeff standing by the windowsill, staring out the front of the house. "Jeff!" I called out, a little louder this time, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Oh, hey," he said, as if nothing was unusual. "I didn't mean to startle you. Just thought I'd finish up the last of the painting." I stared at him for a moment. "It's late. Don't you think you should go home?" He didn't immediately respond. He just stood there, his eyes meeting mine for a moment before he finally nodded. Yeah, I'll head out soon. Just need to clean up a bit, and I'll be gone." I didn't like it. I didn't like that he was here at such a late hour, especially without telling me. I told myself I was probably overreacting, maybe he just wanted to get the job done. But every time I saw him lingering after hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I stayed home to work from the house. I had a few meetings, and I figured it would be a good chance to observe the progress without leaving for long stretches of time. By midday, most of the crew had packed up and left, and I was alone in the house with just Jeff there, as usual. He told me he needed to finish up a few things in the bathroom, so I stayed in my office, trying to focus on work. About an hour later, I got up to grab some water and noticed that the bathroom door was closed, which I thought was odd. I hadn't heard any work being done for a while, and I figured he had left for the day. But when I walked past the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing heavily, like they were trying to be quiet. I froze, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but it didn't sound like normal work noises. I waited for a moment, holding my breath, but it was dead quiet again. After a few seconds, I knocked lightly on the door. "Jeff," I called, trying to sound calm, though my voice was shaky. "Everything okay in there?" There was a pause, followed by a quiet, "Yeah, just making sure the floor's level. I'll be done soon." I wanted to ask him why he was still here, why he was taking so long, but instead, I just nodded and went back to my office. The next day, things got worse. Jeff was still staying late, but this time, he started leaving things in the house. Tools, a bag of cement, a few paint cans, nothing huge, but it was strange. When I asked him about it, he said he was just storing stuff overnight. That was when I decided to call the contractor and check in. I hadn't mentioned any of my concerns to the contractor before, figuring I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't take it anymore. I explained the situation, and they assured me it was a mistake, that Jeff was probably just working overtime and forgot to clean up. They promised to send someone else the next day to make sure the job was on track. The next day, the foreman came to inspect the house. When we walked into the kitchen, I was horrified to see that the kitchen windows had been left open, even though the crew always locked everything up before leaving. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. Jeff's tools were scattered around the yard, just lying there. They weren't where they had been left the night before. I called the police. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. When they came to question Jeff, he acted strangely. He kept saying he was just trying to finish the work, but he didn't have a reasonable explanation for why he'd stayed late or left tools behind. When they went through his bag, they found nothing of interest, but that didn't make me feel any better. I never saw Jeff again after that. The foreman assured me that he'd been let go, but I wasn't convinced. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong that night. I never found out why he stayed so late, or what he was really doing when I wasn't around. It was late, later than I meant for it to be. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home from visiting my sister. The highway felt endless, and I was running on fumes literally and figuratively. When I saw the gas station sign, I almost felt relieved. It was one of those small, out-of-the-way places, just a few pumps and a little building with flickering lights, but it was the only thing around for miles. I pulled in, parked next to one of the pumps, and went inside to pay. The place was empty except for the guy behind the counter, a younger guy who barely looked up from his phone when I walked in. I told him I needed to fill up and asked if they had a restroom. He nodded toward the back and muttered something about a key. There wasn't anyone else in the store, so I grabbed the key hanging on the hook by the counter and headed to the restroom. The door was one of those heavy, industrial ones, with peeling paint and a rusty lock. Inside, the place was as bad as you'd expect: dirty tiles, a flickering light, and a smell that made me want to hold my breath. But I didn't have a choice. I had to go. I was quick, trying to touch as little as possible. When I finished, I washed my hands and dried them on my jeans because the paper towel dispenser was empty. Then I went to leave. The door wouldn't open. At first, I thought maybe the lock was jammed. I tried turning the handle again, harder this time, but it didn't budge. I checked the lock itself, twisting it back and forth, but it was already unlocked. That's when I realized the problem wasn't the lock. The door was being held shut from the outside. I knocked, then banged on the door. Hello? Hey. The door stuck. My voice echoed in the tiny space, but there was no answer. I waited, listening. I thought maybe the guy at the counter would come check, but it was dead silent. I banged again, harder this time, and yelled, "Can someone open the door?" Nothing. My heart started to race. I tried to think logically. Maybe the door was heavy, and it got stuck somehow. Maybe the guy at the counter didn't hear me. But then I remembered how quiet it was in the store when I walked in. He had to have heard me. I pulled out my phone to call the gas station, but there was no signal. Just a spinning wheel where the bars should have been. I tried moving around the tiny room, holding the phone up, but it didn't make a difference. I was completely cut off. Panic started creeping in, but I told myself to stay calm. I knocked again, softer this time, hoping someone passing by might hear me. Hello? Can someone let me out? The door stuck. My voice sounded shaky now, and hearing it like that made the panic worse. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear anything on the other side. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Then I heard something, a shuffling sound, like footsteps. Relief flooded me. Hey! I'm stuck in here. Can you open the door? The footsteps stopped. I waited, expecting to hear the scrape of the lock or the door handle turning, but nothing happened. Hello? I called again. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against me. Then the footsteps started again, slower this time, moving away from the door. Wait. Don't leave. I yelled, banging on the door again. But whoever it was, they were gone. I felt trapped in every sense of the word. The tiny bathroom felt smaller with each passing second, and the silence outside made it worse. I tried to think of a way out. The window was too high and too small to climb through, and the walls were solid concrete. There was no way out except the door. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually, I heard something again. A faint creak, like the sound of a door opening. My heart leapt. Maybe the guy from the counter had finally realized what happened. I pressed my ear to the door again, straining to hear. Hello? I called, but my voice sounded weak now. The footsteps were back, heavier this time, and getting closer. They stopped just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. Is someone there? For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, there was a soft tap on the other side of the door. Just one deliberate knock. I stumbled back, my chest tight and my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I tried to sound firm, but my voice cracked. "Let me out." No response. The knock didn't come again. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to help me. They were toying with me. I fumbled with my phone again, praying for a signal, but it was useless. The spinning wheel taunted me, and I felt the weight of the situation pressing down. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of whoever was on the other side. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just when I thought they might have left, the doorknob turned. It moved slowly, the sound of metal against metal sending a chill through me. I held my breath, frozen in place. The door opened just a crack, enough for me to see a sliver of the dimly lit hallway beyond. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The door didn't open any further, but it didn't close either. I couldn't see anyone on the other side, just the empty space beyond the crack. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the small space, and I stumbled back, hitting the sink. My hands were shaking, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in there. I don't know where I found the strength, but I ran to the door and pounded on it with everything I had. "Let me out." I screamed over and over again. "Let me out." And then, as suddenly as it started, the door opened. It didn't creak this time. It just swung open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. There was no one there. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't even stop to look at the counter as I bolted out of the gas station and into my car. The pump was still in my tank, the meter frozen mid-fill, but I didn't care. I yanked it out, threw it onto the ground, and sped away. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing: I'll never stop at a gas station that isolated again. We got home earlier than planned because the dinner at the restaurant wrapped up quicker than we thought. My wife and I were both in a good mood, laughing about some silly joke the waiter had made. As I unlocked the front door, the house was quiet, which struck me as odd. Normally, we'd hear the faint sound of cartoons or our son's little giggles from the living room. When we stepped inside, the babysitter, Claire, was standing in the middle of the hallway. She was facing us, her arms hanging stiff by her sides, but she didn't say anything right away. I said, "Hey, Claire, we're back. Everything okay?" She didn't answer, just stared at us with this blank look, like she was trying to figure something out. My wife nudged me, giving me a look like, "What's up with her?" Before I could say anything else, Claire moved toward the door behind us and locked it. Her movements were deliberate, not hurried, but very precise. The sound of the deadbolt clicking felt louder than it should have in the silence. I asked her, "Why'd you lock the door?" She turned back to face me, her eyes wide now, but not scared, more like alert. "I don't think it's safe to leave yet," she said, her voice low and steady. "Safe? What do you mean?" my wife asked, stepping closer to me. Claire glanced toward the staircase, then back to us. "I heard something upstairs," she said. "I didn't want to panic your son, so I stayed down here with him. That sent a chill through me. You didn't check? I asked. She shook her head. No, I thought it'd be better to wait for you to get back. I glanced at my wife. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open like she was about to say something but didn't know what. Where's Jason? I asked, referring to our son. He's asleep in his room, Claire said quickly, almost too quickly. I checked on him a few minutes ago. He's fine. I wanted to believe her, but something about her tone made my stomach twist. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince us. I looked toward the stairs. The hallway leading to the bedrooms was dark, the kind of darkness that feels heavier somehow when you're already on edge. My wife started to move toward the staircase, but Claire stepped in front of her. I really don't think you should go up there right now, she said firmly, almost like she was scolding her. What are you talking about? My wife snapped. That's my son up there. Claire didn't move. I can't let you, she said, her voice quieter now but still firm. Not until I'm sure it's safe. I was starting to get angry, but more than that, I was scared. I didn't understand what was happening, and the way Claire was acting didn't make any sense. She'd always been this sweet, calm girl who our son loved. This was completely out of character for her. Move, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. We're going upstairs. She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed and stepped aside. Just be careful, she said. Her tone wasn't threatening, but it wasn't exactly reassuring either. We went up the stairs together, my wife clutching my arm. The floor creaked under our feet, every sound magnified in the quiet. When we reached Jason's room, I pushed the door open slowly. He was there, curled up under his blanket, his chest rising and falling in the soft glow of his nightlight. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air in the room felt wrong. Heavy. I backed out of the room, closing the door as quietly as I could. My wife looked at me, her eyes questioning. I just shook my head, not wanting to speak out loud. As we turned to head back downstairs, we heard a faint sound, like a soft rustling, coming from the hallway closet. My wife grabbed my arm tighter, her nails digging into my skin. Claire's words echoed in my head. I heard something upstairs. I stepped toward the closet, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My wife whispered, "Don't," but I ignored her. I had to know. I reached out and grabbed the doorknob, my hand trembling. Slowly, I turned it and pulled the door open. The closet was empty, just coats and shoes. I let out a shaky breath, feeling both relieved and a little ridiculous. But then, as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. One of the coats was moving, ever so slightly, like it had been brushed by something or someone. I yanked the coat aside, and there, crouched in the shadows, was a man. He was filthy, his clothes torn and stained, his eyes wide and wild. Before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking me back into the hallway. My wife screamed, and Jason started crying in his room. The man didn't say anything, just scrambled to his feet and bolted down the stairs. We chased after him, but by the time we got to the living room, the front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Claire was gone too. We called the police, of course. They came, searched the house, and took our statements. They said Claire was probably just scared and ran when the man did, but that didn't sit right with me. The way she acted, the way she tried to keep us from going upstairs, it felt like she knew he was there. Like she was trying to protect him or keep us from finding out. We never saw her again. She didn't show up for her next scheduled babysitting job, and when we tried to contact her, her phone was disconnected. The police said they'd look into it, but as far as I know, they never found her. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was more to it than we'll ever know.